Hello, welcome everyone. So today I'm going to be responding to some feedback that I've received, or at least it's been given. I suppose I haven't exactly received it. Uh, anyway, that'll be clear later what I mean by that. Regarding my RHBS model, so the resurrection, not resurrection, it's a model of the resurrection appearances and claims that surround, obviously, Jesus Christ following his death at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So the RHBS stands for reburial, hallucination, biases, and socialization, and it's my preferred explanation, which I outline in my book, of the facts surrounding Jesus' death and crucifixion and resurrection appearance claims. The point of the explanation is not necessarily to say this is exactly what happened historically, although I think it's a plausible reconstruction, but it's more that the purpose of it is to explain, is to provide a naturalistic explanation of the minimal facts as outlined by scholars like, well, specifically William Lane Craig, but also Mike Licona and Gary Habermas and others. So that's its purpose. I don't necessarily expect that other atheists or skeptics will agree with all of those minimal facts, but it doesn't really matter from my point of view, because the point, again, its purpose is not to sort of persuade you that that's what happened. Rather, it's to say, given the minimal facts, how could we account for them naturalistically? And I think it does a good job of that. So that's just a caveat at the outset, because I always feel the need to clarify what the purpose of it is. But so I haven't received that much specific detailed feedback on the model. However, I did a few weeks ago receive an email from someone who was apparently in an exchange on some forum. I haven't actually been able to find the original source, but it doesn't matter that much for our purposes here. Apparently in an exchange where they were discussing my model with, I assume, a Christian, and the Christian offered some objections. So I'm going to be looking at those here and responding to them. Mostly they consist of me sort of responding to misconceptions of the model, although there are some other matters that I'll discuss. And then while we're sort of here, because I've been meaning to do this stream for a while, I'm also going to respond to some comments made by S.J. Thompson. Oh, no, it's not Thompson, sorry. Thomason. S.J. Thomason. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So she recently did a video responding to the Bad Apologetics episode 13 that Camille, Nathan, and I did about Dr. Andrew Loke's book. And in that, she briefly made some comments about my RHBS model as well. So I thought that might as well throw those in. And as we discuss this, I'll also be going through and making some comments about the Gospels and about new religious movements and so forth, which might add a bit of flavor to some of this discussion. So hopefully this will be interesting. That all being said, let's now jump into this. So here is the excerpts that I have from this response to my RHBS model. I should say at the outset that it's fairly clear to me that the person who's writing this is only responding to a brief summary of the model. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the summary was that they saw, but because there's things here that I think they wouldn't have said if they'd read either the chapter in my book or the blog posts I've written about this. I understand that it's a bit rough to say, well, you need to read my book before you can sort of comment on something, but that's why I have written a blog post on this. I'll put a link to that in the description. Also, it's not a whole book you have to read. It's only one chapter of this book, which is not too long. There's parts you can skim through. The books you can buy for like $8 on for a digital copy. So I don't think it's too much to ask in terms of like pre-reading for people to comment on on a naturalistic explanation of the minimal facts. It's not like I'm saying you have to read a 500-page book that costs $50 or something. And it is available on a blog post, and I'm trying to make it more accessible through YouTube videos as well. Eventually, I will do a highly, edited and fancy one explaining it. But, those take a lot of time. And so in the meantime, I'm sort of relying on these more discursive videos. So I guess at the outset, because I'm going to say, well, they haven't read this, or I explain this further here, and I understand that there's a certain aspect to that which is well, I'm not going to go and read all of these books, but I do think that it's not actually that long what I'm trying to present. Obviously it's more than can be presented in a few paragraphs, but so I am trying to make that accessible. It is available on my blog, and it's only one chapter of a book that's fairly accessible. So that being said, I want to acknowledge that as a potential concern, but moving beyond that, let's now dig into this and see what they have to say about the RHBS model. I'm going to assume that you have a general idea of what it is. I guess I'll explain it as we go. So I don't want to put any more boilerplate before we actually get into it here. So I won't give a separate summary. Okay, so I think this is them quoting me. That's fine. So they like the fact that I'm trying to give an explanation here of the minimal facts. And this is one of the reasons why I think that this is a good approach, because Christians usually respond well to taking the facts seriously. Again, even if you don't acknowledge the facts, you can take them just as a presumption, or for the sake of argument or whatever, and then see where we can go with providing an explanation for them. Because I think that it is not the case that if all of the facts were established and we just accepted them, that we would then be required rationally to become Christians or to believe in the resurrection. I think most atheists don't think that either. And so let's at least say that there's that part of a good response to a resurrection argument is to attempt to give a response to the minimal facts, even if that's not the whole of the account. So that's the game that I'm trying to play here. If you see what I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. And as I've said, in this and other contexts, I have found that this often makes a good impression. So I think that can maybe get past some of the barriers that, in terms of listening to what atheists will have to say about this, especially because Jesus mythicism is becoming more popular. And I think that that's not really, it's an interesting idea intellectually, but I don't think it's the most plausible position by far. And so I think that one of the problems with that is that it really creates a barrier between us and them with two extremes. It's everything the Gospels or Jesus didn't even exist. And I think it's more helpful to try to tread some middle ground there. Anyway, so I think that's good. Let's see. Now, what they say here is interesting. Hang on. Where I think he already goes astray a bit is the atheist's job is not merely to present a plausible account, but one that is more fully comprehensive or perfect than the canonical gospel accounts. Okay, so there's a difference in methodology there. So. And this is, well, actually, maybe I'll go through the next paragraph and then discuss this. So it is not enough to produce an alternative hypothesis. One has to present a better one. After all, it's like a flat earther trying to argue, while he agrees with the scientific evidence about the picture of the earth being round, all he has to do is provide a plausible account of the same evidence. All he would have to then claim is that the pictures were staged by NASA to secure more funding from taxpayers, for example. This is a plausible explanation for why NASA may have fabricated evidence of a round Earth, but is it a far cry from a fully comprehensive or perfect explanation? It is most definitely not a better explanation. I'm going to assume that wherever they were typing this, they couldn't use bold or italics, which is why they've used all caps. Otherwise, it is a bit grating. I feel like I need to yell all those words, but I'll give the benefit of the doubt there. Anyway, okay. And then this paragraph is finishing that point. So the point is this: if James is willing to go so far as to admit the possibility of miracles, which again I do for the sake of argument, then he becomes obliged to provide a better, more fully comprehensive explanation for the facts than a miraculous body explanation already provides. Otherwise, he's just being a version of a flat earther. So, I mean, I don't think I'm being a flat earther here, but let's look at what he said here. And I think that this is a somewhat common response here, to say that it's not enough to give an explanation or even a plausible explanation. You have to give a better explanation. Now, in a sense, I agree with that, in the sense that explanations attempt to provide plausibility for whatever they're trying to explain. So that's sometimes called the explanandum, the thing that you're trying to explain, basically a set of facts or phenomena. Here it's the minimal facts. So that's what we're trying to explain. In terms of how you assess explanations, you assess them on the basis of generally accepted criteria for assessing an explanation. So there's no one set of standards that is universally accepted, but there are pretty commonly accepted criteria that you look at. So you look at its plausibility, you look at its simplicity, you look at its explanatory scope, explanatory power, you look at its coherence. I think you can reduce those down to maybe 2 or 3 fundamental criteria, but that's not super important for our purposes here. What I want to consider is that when I say that we need the atheist should attempt to provide a better explanation, that means an explanation that scores better, or that fulfills the criteria for a good explanation better than the resurrection hypothesis. That's what is meant by better explanation. Greater fulfillment of the explanatory criteria, of the criteria for a good explanation, right? What do I not mean by a better explanation? In what sense do I disagree with what he's saying here? Well, I disagree with if he means better by more persuasive, or more poetic, or more meaningful, or just more comprehensive in the sense that it says more things. Now, I think it's really tricky because people often actually use those as criteria for judging an explanation. If it resonates with them, if it just seems to fit well, if it provides a picture that's easier to understand in your mind or easier to kind of tell a story, then that feels more persuasive. There's actually a lot of evidence about this. Maybe I should actually compile some of that and talk about it another time. But basically, there are lots of psychological tricks that we sort of play on ourselves and play with each other about assessing explanations. And there's a lot of things that we do there that lead us astray. Actually, one good example of this that occurs to me, that there's that famous experiment where they ask people to judge the plausibility of two statements, or I guess like settings. One is a I don't remember exactly how it works, but basically there's in each of the scenarios there's a young woman who works at a bank, and they asked you would assess the plausibility of two statements, that just like this young woman works at a bank, and the other one says this young woman works at a bank and is active in the feminist movement. But the thing is, they've given you a whole bunch of statements about that woman, about her views and what she did at university and whatever. I guess I should look this up before trying to explain it because I don't remember the details. But the point is, most people say that the second is more plausible. That it's more plausible that she works at a bank and is active in the feminist movement. The problem with that is that, you know, the conjunct of two things can never be more likely than just one of those things together. Because, you know, there's always fewer people who are doing two things in one thing, essentially, to put it crudely. So what I think people are doing in that case is not really judging probability per se, but they're assessing plausibility on the basis of an account that they construct for themselves or a story that they tell. And in one case, there's a more sort of coherent and elegant and sensible, resonating story about someone who is has a certain set of beliefs and, you know, was activist at university and so on, and is also then currently inactive in the feminist movement. So that feels more plausible, even though it is less plausible because it introduces extra assumptions that you don't actually have in what was given. Anyway, that's just a study that I recall. There's many others that have been done on this sort of point. So what I want to say here is I think this is a massive barrier in any attempt to provide an explanation for the minimal fact, because Christians will pretty much always find the gospel accounts more plausible. They're used to them. They resonate emotionally with them, spiritually. They seem to fit well because they tell a coherent narrative, even if there are discrepancies, but they kind of don't notice those. And I think that the honest atheist or skeptic can't really provide a narrative that is as coherent and as emotionally fulfilling and as persuasive as that, because there are just too many gaps. I try to fill in some of those gaps with what I think is plausible, but I don't I'm not writing a story. I'm not trying to write a gospel, right? This is not something you could make into a film without lots more assumptions. So a narrative is always more persuasive than basically an academic or a historical hypothesis, and that's what I'm offering here. I don't offer a narrative. The Gospels have narratives with emotional and spiritual power, and mine doesn't. So it's sort of never going to be that persuasive, and I think that's the problem. And I don't know that I have a good answer to this, other than I think inviting people to try and step outside what they're used to, step outside what's emotionally comforting, and be sort of skeptical and critical, and think and try to assess an explanation on the basis of the criteria for good explanation. And narrative coherence and fit and emotional fulfillment and so forth is not a criteria for good explanation. And just to make sure that people are clear about that, Lord of the Rings is a really great story, right? But it's a really great story because it has a narrative arc, and it has character development, and it has a series of events that, you know, lead to the climax. And so it's very powerful, and it's very satisfying as a story. History is often not like that. History is often a bunch of things happen, and we're not really sure exactly how they fit together. We construct some stories or accounts that may be plausible, but you can never fill in all the gaps, and it doesn't necessarily have great resonance. It's kind of like, you know, one damn thing after another, as the famous quote says. History is often not like Lord of the Rings in that it's just not as satisfying, as persuasive. There's not as clear point to it in the same way, and you often just don't fill in all the details that you would want to fill in. And so that is what any, I think, honest naturalistic account is going to be like. There are going to be gaps. It's not really going to be fulfilling. It's not going to be a narrative in the same way that the Gospels are. It's also just going to be different to what the Christians expect, because obviously it's not the Gospels. Breaking through that is hard, and I think that we just have to try to encourage people to step outside their bubble and think about things in a different way. So I think that is what is happening here in these early paragraphs here. When I say that my explanation is not fully comprehensive or perfect, it's because there's lots of gaps in it, because we just don't know. we don't exactly know how the disciples went from, say, discovering the empty tomb, as I postulate, to, teaching about the risen Jesus. I say that there were hallucinations, and that there was collective experiences, and there was biases, memory biases, and socialization. But these are general factors. That they're not a narrative that, like, Peter went to this place and he saw this, and then he said this to this other person. So it's just not as persuasive and comprehensive in the same way. So if that's what you're looking for, I think that the RHBS model will never offer that, right? And that's because we can't offer that as, not even just as historians, but I think just as honest skeptical seekers, because we just don't have enough evidence for that. And the Gospels do offer that, and so they're always going to be more persuasive in that sense. But I just think that's an important point to make. And so if we want to do this, we really need to be honest and try to move outside the what's a persuasive narrative world to what is a good explanation. Okay, so a good explanation is not necessarily a persuasive narrative, and vice versa. That's really what I'm trying to say here. So I'm trying to offer a good explanation, not a persuasive narrative. And unfortunately, persuasive narratives don't necessarily attract people. But I think that I think I said it the wrong way. Persuasive narratives are what attract people, not necessarily good explanations. All right, so that's enough on that point. Let's move on and start looking into the details. So RHBS fails on multiple points. So I think he basically responds to the key points of the model one at a time, so that's good. So we'll follow that. Let's start with reburial. So this is highly implausible for many reasons. First, Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy member of the Jewish Sanhedrin and was a powerful man in his own right. So we don't really know that. We don't know anything about Joseph of Arimathea other than that he was a member of the council. Now, presumably he was wealthy and powerful because he was a member of the council, but we don't really know any of the details there. So I'm happy to grant that for the sake of argument, but I'm just going to push back a bit, saying we don't actually have any real knowledge of who he was or what he did afterwards. But okay, let's say he was wealthy and powerful. I mean, he would have had to be wealthy at least to have a rock-hewn tomb that he could put Jesus in. The Romans would have been breaking their own laws by opening this private tomb after granting him custody of the body for reburial. So this is why I say it doesn't seem like he's really read the model, because I don't say that the Romans moved the body. I say that Joseph of Arimathea probably moved the body. There are other possibilities, but that's the one that I sort of talk about the most. So this objection is just kind of irrelevant because that's not what I'm arguing. But also, I mean, maybe Joseph of Arimathea asked the Romans to move the body. It's not like the Romans were one group. I don't think the Roman authorities would have moved the body on his behalf because they wouldn't have cared, I don't think. But, and this is actually another misconception, that Joseph of Arimathea was out there dragging Jesus' body around. No, I mean, if he's a wealthy man, he's not going to do this himself. He's going to tell his servants to do it. It's probable Joseph of Arimathea, if he did move the body, as I think he did, never himself visited Jesus in the tomb, at least after he was originally buried there. He may have not even visited him then. But if he did, I don't think he was there when the body was moved. His servants would have done it. And his servants are probably Jewish, but I mean, there may have been Romans in there. Who knows? Like, that's not even really the point. Anyway, so why grant Joseph of Arimathea the body in the first place? Good question. If the Romans all along wanted to dispose of Jesus' body in some criminal's grave, why not simply refuse to question chop Jesus' body along with other criminals? So I think that possibly happened, right? But if you say that Jesus was buried in a mass grave, then you can't account for the empty tomb because you don't think there was a tomb to be empty. So I think it's plausible that did happen. But that's just that's again not the game I'm playing, in the sense that I'm trying to offer an explanation of the minimal facts, which includes an empty tomb. So I'm not going to go with that explanation. I'm going to say, okay, there was an empty tomb. So, and I'm even going to grant that Joseph of Arimathea was a real figure. He might not have been, but let's say he was, because it's not that implausible, I think, and that he did indeed bury Jesus's body in his private tomb. So this objection seems to be misconstruing the idea that the Romans asked for the body back from Joseph of Arimathea, which is not what I argue. This makes no sense for the Romans to do. It actually only raises more questions when they later chose to rob Joseph's tomb and dump Jesus' body elsewhere. So even if I did think that the Romans asked for the body back for some reason, that wouldn't really have been a robbery, would it? It would have been some sort of requisition. That's not something I'd really even considered before, but maybe Pilate changed his mind. Maybe Pilate said, yeah, sure, have Jesus' body, whatever, I don't care. Just make sure you bury it somewhere out of the way where there's no trouble. But maybe later he decided, you know what, that site may become a venerated shrine by some of his followers, and that could cause more trouble. So I'm actually going to get them to take the body out and put it somewhere where no one knows where it is, and it's in a mass grave to avoid any further issues. Maybe that happened. I mean, that's an interesting possibility I hadn't even considered before. No evidence for that, but there's no real evidence for any of these hypotheses. They're all just, including the resurrection, by the way, they're all just attempts to explain the data. So yeah, I think that's an interesting possibility, but it's not the one that I think is most likely. I'm going with Joseph Arimathea always intended to rebury the body or move the body to a permanent burial site, and he was just temporarily storing it in his private tomb over the Sabbath because they needed somewhere to store it over the Sabbath because it was very late when Jesus was on the cross and they had to take the body down to respect the Jewish laws. And also B, they wanted to ensure, the authorities that is, and the Sanhedrin wanted to ensure that it was somewhere that was out of the way, private, that wouldn't cause a ruckus of moving the body through places in the streets or wherever where people could see, or putting it in a public place where there might have been more trouble, because they just wanted to keep the peace. And that was the Romans' big priority. So basically, the Jews wanted to preserve their laws or to keep their laws. The Romans wanted to keep the peace. Putting the body temporarily in Joseph's tomb was a compromise that satisfied those two views, those two concerns. And after the Sabbath, after it had died down, it was removed and permanently buried somewhere else. That's my hypothesis. I think there are many other plausible possibilities as well, including tomb robbery, including that Joseph Arimathea always intended to keep the body in his tomb, but changed his mind and was prevailed upon on the Sabbath by his family to move it, which is why it was removed. Or even this case that I've just thought of now, that the Romans actually told Joseph Arimathea to move it, or that Joseph Arimathea never existed in the first place, but it was buried in someone else's tomb. Many possibilities here, but I think this particular objection that the Romans stole the body doesn't make sense, because that's not one that I've advocated or I've ever heard anyone advocate. Okay, so let's move on. The moment the rumors started to circulate that Jesus was alive, why didn't they simply say, "No, you idiots, we dumped the body in the mass grave over here"? They didn't. Instead, they made up a story that the disciples had stolen the body. This implies that Jewish and Roman leaders could neither produce the body nor simply say that his body be moved. And more details follow, such as the fact that the burial clothes are still in the tomb, neatly folded. Let's talk about this one and get it over quickly. So I actually do mention this briefly in my book. This is an example, the first of many cases where we're going to see in this response that the atheist is asked to explain every detail from the Gospels. Now, maybe some would disagree with me, but I don't think so. So I think I'm on fairly safe ground in saying there is no naturalistic explanation that can explain all the details from the Gospels. I mean, how could there be? It literally says that Jesus performed miracles, right? So that's kind of silly, right? If you believe every detail in the Gospels, just go to the part where it says Jesus was the Christ or Jesus was the Son of God or whatever. And then why do we need to play this game about offering explanations? Okay, that's kind of silly. The purpose of what I'm doing is to try to offer an explanation of the minimal facts. And the minimal facts can vary a bit, but if I can recall correctly, in Craig's case, that includes Jesus died, he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, his tomb was found empty by women followers, various of his followers then reported experiencing Jesus, appearing to them on a variety of occasions in groups and as individuals, and then they came to believe that he had been resurrected, and they preached that. So I think those are Craig's 5 minimal facts. Others offer slightly different minimal facts, which I can also account for with the model, as long as they don't include the conversion of Paul, because the RHBS model cannot explain the conversion of Paul. I'll come back to that later. But I think any other list that I've seen, the RHBS can account for. At least it calls itself minimal facts. Now, there are maximal facts people out there, and this guy seems to be one of them, who think that we need to account for all of the things that it says in the New Testament or in the Gospels about the resurrection appearances. And that's just impossible. You can't do that naturalistically because they're supernatural accounts, right? The question would be, why should we accept all of those particulars, such as the burial robes, for example, being found neatly folded? Why accept those as historical? They're not minimal facts, and so we're not trying to account for them. In order to establish them as historical, we need to have sufficient evidence to grant them as historical. Now, if you think that, well, the Gospels say it, so it must be true, is sufficient, then why bother with this argument in the first place? Just go to where it says Jesus was the Christ. So I don't really understand. This seems to be some Christians just unable to think outside their worldview. They think that everyone just believes everything that they do, except this one thing that Jesus rose from the dead. It's literally like they think that atheists believe that all of the appearances and the eating of the fish and the coming out of the empty tomb and all the walking through doors and all that stuff happened just as it says. It's just that atheists don't think that Jesus was risen from the dead. No, atheists don't believe most of those things. In fact, some atheists don't believe anything that it says in the Gospels. I'm not quite that far. I think the Gospels do preserve some historical facts, but there's many embellishments and later developments and memory distortion and so on that have contributed to that. So this is just really a call to Christians responding to my account, or really any attempt to account for the minimal facts, as to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes the non-believer's shoes and imagine what it would be like to not just accept everything that it says in the Gospels at face value. Here, where I'm just working with the minimal facts, so I think I'm being fairly generous by just granting all these minimal facts and not disputing them. But in exchange, I want to hold the Christian to those minimal facts and not allow them to postulate anything beyond that, because I've already given them the minimal facts. These facts are supposed to be sufficient to establish their conclusion. So I'm not going to just grant them anything else that's not been established. So this is a point we'll see repeatedly where new details are just sort of pulled from the Gospels and asked to be explained. Camille and others have described this as yellow brick road apologetics, which I actually think is, I mean, it's harsh, but maybe fair. The idea that, well, if Oz doesn't exist, where does the yellow brick road lead to? Sort of like, well, if Jesus wasn't resurrected from the tomb, why were the burial robes neatly folded? Maybe they weren't neatly folded, and it just says that, right? Like, it's not a bit of a smile there. It's like, it's almost as if this doesn't occur to some people. So it's a bit frustrating that, you know, we can't have the discussion on that level. Okay, so, but having said all that, the burial robes could have been neatly folded. Like, let's suppose that Joseph and Arimathea moved the body. There were some robes left over. Someone just folded them up and left them there just because they got forgotten or they just didn't know what to do with them. Like, that's not even that hard to account for, right? The burial robes. I mean, there are some others that are harder to account for, and you're just going to have to say, no, that didn't happen that way. Like, Jesus actually ate fish. But burial robes being folded up is not really that hard. Like, people fold robes. Is that supposed to be impossible to account for? Okay, so that's that detail. Now, let's talk about this fact. Why didn't, well, it just says they here. I'm not sure if this is the Romans or the council or the Jewish authorities. Why didn't they say, hey, we dumped his body in the grave here? Why didn't they say that? So there's a number of points to say about this. First of all, let's take the Roman authorities, because they're sort of separate from they are separate from the Jewish authorities, and they have different interests and motives. The Roman authorities could not have cared less about refuting anything that the disciples were doing or saying. The only thing they cared about was preserving order and ensuring people paid their taxes. And there's a question about whether you take the gospel accounts of the trial and crucifixion of Jesus seriously. I suspect that they do preserve historical truth there, in the fact that it's quite plausible to me that Jesus was eventually crucified because the Jewish authorities were really upset with what he was teaching. Basically, they thought he was a blasphemer, and it seems that he was a blasphemer. If, like me, you don't think that he was the Messiah, then he was a blasphemer. Or certainly not the Son of God. And that was their interest in having him crucified, because he was teaching things that they thought were blasphemy. Now, the Romans really couldn't have cared less about that. But they did care about that if it started to affect public order. And it seems plausible that something like what it says in the Gospels did happen, where there was, there was a big public crowd and people were getting rowdy, and the Jewish authorities were stoking up the flames, and the Romans just wanted it all to go away. And the council gave them a way to make it go away, which was to kill Jesus, right? But after that, the Romans didn't care about what a tiny sect of Jews believed. That there's no reason why they would have paid the slightest bit of attention to it. Now, as for the Jewish authorities, now they did care what people believed, although it's not really clear that they would have kept tabs of the disciples, because it was Jesus who was the real threat, not the disciples. And as I discuss in my book, I mean, I do respond to this point. There's so many reasons why this would, why they wouldn't, they plausibly would not have said anything about what they did with the body. The first is simply that they would have known that even a few days afterwards, after the crucifixion, the body would have become unrecognizable. So no one who already thought Jesus had been resurrected would have been persuaded by a rotting corpse that was not recognizable. That would just be completely unpersuasive. So why bother with it? Second reason, they probably themselves didn't know where Jesus' body was. Yeah, they probably knew that it was dumped in this grave over here, but they wouldn't have been able to identify the particular corpse. Like, it's not like the Jewish council, those rich and powerful men, are themselves dragging the body and dumping it in. It's some schmo, probably slaves or whatever, who are doing this. And they probably wouldn't have even known who specifically did it or who to ask. And the slaves probably had heaps of bodies to deal with. They wouldn't have remembered this particular Jesus guy. So no one knew at that point that it was reburied or originally buried, whichever way it went, in the mass grave, which specific body that it was. So all they would have been able to say is, we reburied it in this mass grave here. He's one of these rotting corpses. That wouldn't have been persuasive to anyone, and so why would they have done it? Now, third point, this assumes that the Jewish council would have even been concerned about what the disciples were saying, I kind of said this before, probably they wouldn't have until sometime later, until they developed some following. Third point here, how do we know that they didn't say this? And we discussed this in the stream that we did, reviewing Loke's book. How do we know that the Jewish council didn't say, hey, you idiots, we dumped the body here? Many Christians say that they didn't say this, instead that they made up this story that disciples had stolen the body. Now, those things aren't mutually exclusive, by the way. They could have said both stories. I mean, the stories are mutually exclusive, but reporting the stories isn't mutually exclusive, particularly if it occurred at different times. So I think it's quite plausible that at various times people on the Jewish council said both of these things to get people to shut up or to go away or whatever. Or maybe they just said that the disciples might have stolen the body or whatever. But anyway, so the point is, we don't know what the Jewish council said. As I keep pointing out, we have exactly 0 hostile or critical accounts of against Christianity from the first century. So there's literally no basis for saying what they did or they did not say. Remember that we are basing this on a minimal facts approach, right? So we're basing this on a certain set of facts that we are granting for the sake of argument and not any others. And the fact that the Jewish council did or did not say anything particular is not one of those minimal facts. But even beyond that, many Christians who are responding to this argument will say that, will also affirm the corpses who are walking in Matthew, and they come out of their graves and they're walking through Jerusalem. Now that is a pretty bizarre and pretty extreme event. Like, Jerusalem wasn't a small city. That's an event that basically everyone there would have noticed. You'd think that would have been recorded somewhere and passed on, because it's a pretty big thing to have happened. But we have no other accounts of that apart from Matthew, not even in any other like Christian documents that are independent of Matthew or any other Jewish or Roman writings. Now, the response to this is usually say, well, that's an argument from silence, and most recordings from that time were preserved anyway, so we shouldn't expect to see that account. Okay, if you're going to say that, if you're going to make the argument, if you're going to say that's an invalid argument from silence, this is also an invalid argument from silence, because it's much less likely that whatever the Jewish council was saying about Jesus's body would be preserved than corpses walking all throughout Jerusalem accounts of that would be preserved. So I don't see any reason to think that we know what the Jewish council did or did not say. So in summary, maybe they did say this and we just don't know. There's no reason why they would have necessarily said this, because it wouldn't have persuaded anyone. They probably didn't know which specific body was Jesus's, because they wouldn't have kept records of that. It would have been decayed. And I've forgotten the other thing I said. There was another reason that I said that this is implausible. The other thing was that they may not have even had reason or incentive to respond to what the disciples were saying at that early period. Because why would they? Unless they were causing trouble and it started a significant movement like Jesus had, then they wouldn't have cared about it. To someone in the chat, yes, I do think that Jesus was buried in a tomb. What I'm trying to explain is I'm responding to the argument about what happened to Jesus's body after it was removed from the tomb and placed in a mass grave, which is what I think happened. And this would also apply, by the way, if you think that Jesus was never buried in a tomb, was just directly put in the mass grave. The concern is, well, the authorities would have said that they did that, and I'm responding to that objection. Nathan, I don't know who that is, although it sounds like a Muslim ? So I can guess what they might have said, but that's not also what I'm responding to here. If you can link me to something, maybe I'll do another video responding to that. Anyway, so moving on. For those who came a bit late, I'm responding to criticisms of the RHBS model that someone sent to me from a discussion they had on a forum somewhere. I haven't been able to find the original link, so I've just been sent this text. And I think that this is illustrative of some other objections that I've heard more anecdotally, so that's why I think this is useful. Hopefully you're finding it interesting. All right, so we've been through that. Let's see. I would not even call it plausible, as it requires making too many completely unjustified assumptions, as the Romans performing directly contradictory actions, granting Jesus' body to Joseph to bury, then in some supposed effort to maintain public order, choose to just secretly move the body only to create the very rooms they were trying to avoid. Why not just leave the body buried where it was? No one could have claimed he had risen from the dead then. So I've sort of already responded to this. The Romans couldn't have cared less if you thought that someone rose from the dead. It's public order that they cared about. So I don't think the Romans were involved in this. It's the Jewish authorities who plausibly were involved. Maybe maybe they were the ones who encouraged Joseph to move the body because they didn't want it in his tomb, giving legitimacy to it or whatever. Or maybe Joseph of Arimathea changed his mind and was prevailed upon by his family. Or, which I think is the most likely explanation, Joseph of Arimathea always intended to move the body because he didn't want it in his tomb, because it was an expensive family tomb, rock-hewn tomb, right? He was prevailed upon to put it there temporarily because of the public order concerns and because of the Jewish Sabbath concerns. So there was always an intention to move it. And it wasn't the Romans doing it. I don't think that, although, it's possible that maybe this was all at the instigation of the Romans to move it because Pilate changed his mind or whatever. I don't think that's the most likely explanation. So I don't think we need to say the Romans are performing any contradictory actions here. Hang on. Oh, and this point about making unjustified assumptions. So this will come up again later. So I have to make assumptions to provide an explanation. That's what you do when you provide an explanation. You make assumptions, and then you see what those assumptions entail, and and then evaluate that explanation on the basis of its explanatory power with respect to the things you're trying to explain. So that's the whole point of an explanation. You can't explain anything without starting somewhere. The question is how plausible those assumptions are, and how they cohere with each other and with other things that we think we know, and how much explanatory power they have. So the fact that I'm making an assumption here that Joseph of Arimathea moved the body is not in itself a problem. The question is how plausible is that assumption, and I think it's quite plausible. All right, let's move on. So he thinks that's busted. Okay, I don't think so. Moving on, individual hallucinations. So this is the next aspect of the model. So he says individual hallucinations may happen in the mentally ill. Not sure why that's quoted. There is zero evidence that any of the people involved were mentally ill in the first place. So this is a common misconception that only mentally ill people hallucinate. In fact, hallucinations are very common in the general population, and I discuss this in my book. Maybe I'll just read a few quotes from that. Let me see, because I've got the PDF open here, so I can refer to that. Production of the body, nope. Hallucinatory experience. Here we go. So this is on page 257 of my book. Surveys of hallucinatory experiences suggest that 10 to 25% of the general population have had such experiences, which are specifically auditory hallucinations, at least once. Morrison concluded that these findings suggest that hallucinations may be normal responses to certain events or triggers, end quote. That's a quote from a study. You can find, I won't give the references here, but you can find them in my book. So here's another quote, same page. Quote, hallucinations are perceptual phenomena involved in many fields of pathology, although clinically widely reported studies in the general population of these phenomena are scant. So actually, we don't even know that much about their prevalence, but we do know something. So continuing the quote, this issue was investigated using representative samples of the non-institutionalized general population of the UK, Germany, and Italy, aged 15 years or over. So 13,000 people surveyed. Overall, 38.7% of the sample reported hallucinatory experiences. Skipping forward a bit, these hallucinations occurred one at sleep onset, which is hypnagogic hallucinations in 1/4, and or upon awakening, hypnopompic hallucinations, which is in 6.6% of the sample, without relationship to a specific pathology in more than half of the cases. So that would be about 20%. During the daytime and reported by 27% of the sample, so including visual, 3.2%, auditory, 0.6% of hallucinations were strongly related to psychotic pathology. Haptic hallucinations are reported by 3.1% with current use of drugs as the highest risk factor. So there, end quote. So there certainly is an association in some cases with hallucinations and pathology, but not in the majority of cases. And this particular study found that, what was it, about 39% of the non-institutionalized, that means out of hospitals or prisons, population experienced hallucinations. And many of those were related to sleep, but not all of them. And we also don't know that the disciples' hallucinations didn't begin with sleep either. So, I mean, there's more that I cite there, but the point is that hallucinations are really not that closely associated with psychopathology. They are in certain cases, like schizophrenia, but they're actually quite common in the healthy population. Okay, so let's move forward here. Grief hallucinations, which I discussed, or bereavement hallucinations that I discussed, are quite common, and I think that those were the initial triggers of the hallucinations which led to the belief in the resurrected Jesus. So he says, even if one person was hallucinating, the other people would be able to say, Jesus, where? There's no one there. The specific nature of these encounters also argues against them being hallucinations. Thomas refused to believe the reports. First of all, if he didn't hallucinate the first time, there's no reason to believe that he would hallucinate the next time. Further, he touched Jesus' side and the holes in his hands, not auditory, not visual hallucinations, those. So those would be examples of haptic or tactile hallucinations, which do occur as well. So there's no impossibility there. Jesus was recorded eating food and drinking on multiple occasions. These supposed hallucinations that they recorded share nothing at all in common with grief-induced hallucinations. All right, so here we see more what we can call yellow brick road apologetics. So I'm being asked to explain detailed specifics of like the fact that Jesus ate food and that Thomas touched his side. Are those minimal facts? Answer, no, they're not. So they're not things that I'm trying to explain or feel that I have to explain. If I've granted all of those specifics, then I already believe basically everything the Gospels say. So why do I need this argument anyway? Again, the Christian really needs to put themselves in the shoes of a skeptic or a disbeliever and ask themselves, what would I be willing to accept, or what would I consider plausible on that worldview? And they may, and the skeptic may be willing to accept the minimal facts, but they're not just going to grant everything that the Gospel says. So, and I don't think it's plausible to say that those can be established on the basis of historical criteria alone. I'll talk more about that in a moment about the Gospels. But the point here is simply that I'm not trying to explain those. I don't think those are historical. So citing them is not an objection to the model. Yeah, so Bob here is saying, I've experienced in sleep paralysis before. I can definitely see how an ancient person can misattribute that to a real event. Yeah, so those are quite common forms of hallucinations, especially I think they call them night terrors. I don't know if it's understood why, but people often feel extreme like fear and panic when that happens, but they can be paralyzed, which I think would be your case if it's sleep paralysis. So you can't move and people feel an evil presence there. Now, I don't think that specifically would have really fit with the Jesus appearances, because I don't think that the disciples would have attributed that to Jesus. But the point is that this is an example of the sorts of things that can happen, and they're not really that uncommon. And people can be strongly and profoundly impacted by these sorts of experiences. Okay, so what else did I want to say here? I'll get to the multiple people later, because objecting that there are multiple people to the individual hallucinations point doesn't make a lot of sense, because obviously that's not what I'm trying to explain. So the Gospels, I think, mostly talk about Jesus appearing in groups. I think that he appears to Peter in an individual setting, and maybe to one of the women. So there are some reported individual hallucinations. But the important point to understand here is that I am not trying to map one-to-one the appearances or hallucinations that I'm talking about in my model with those in the Gospels. Because, again, the details of the appearances as stated in the Gospels are not minimal facts. I'm just trying to explain appearances to individuals and groups of experiences of the risen Jesus. That's the minimal fact. It's not all of the specifics. So I'll get to the multiple people at each hallucination in a moment, but those are not actually hallucinations. Those are group encounters, which are different. What I think happened is that there were first individual hallucinations, plausibly some of the women, plausibly Peter, but doesn't really matter specifically who, and that those then triggered group experiences when they told them about what happened, plus the empty tomb and plus grief and other things, again, that I'll get to in a moment. So this objection is confusing two aspects of what I'm saying: the individual hallucinations with the group experiences. I think I've responded to everything else here. Yep. Okay, moving on. Perhaps one of the most important differences is that no one who has experienced a grief-induced hallucination has not recognized that they were hallucinating. So I don't like the double negative there. Let's say that everyone who has experienced a grief-induced hallucination has later, let's say, recognized that they were hallucinating. They all say, I could have sworn I heard his or her voice and saw them, but I know they are dead. None of them are so convinced that their loved one was actually alive that they go to court to try to throw out the death certificate, have the deceased one move back in with them. The disciples not only were convinced of the reality of the experiences, they were so convinced that they went from carrying in fear from being killed to 100% confident, not only of his resurrection, but their own. That is not consistent with any individual grief-induced hallucination ever recorded. So I don't grant that they went from carrying in fear to being 100% confident necessarily, because that's not a minimal fact. But I don't think that's super critical here. I have more to say about why they became so confident later on. It wasn't the hallucinations themselves that did this. This is another misconception, to think that we go straight from hallucinations to, powering forward, preaching the gospel to, to the land. No, that's not the model. They think it's just an RH model. That's why it's an RHBS model, because the BS is important, right? Biases and socialization can lead to people believing a lot of strange things. And so you have to see the model as a whole, not just pick parts of it and want that to do all of the work. But coming to the main point here about the fact that everyone who experiences a bereavement hallucination goes on to recognize that they were hallucinating. It's certainly true that that's usually what happens, but it is not true that that's always what happens. And I have examples of this. Now, bear with me a moment. I just have to find them. So there are some cases of what are called complex or complicated bereavement, where people do have experiences of their loved ones, who usually recently dead loved ones, who that they then, at least to some extent, think are veridical. Now, maybe at some point these people can be convinced, but the thing is, when people experience that, they're usually treated in a mental health context these days. So it's a bit hard to compare it directly to what happened with the disciples, because they didn't even really have the concept of mental illness in the way that we have. So to say that, it's the point is, many people these days might be treated and then later come to the belief that what they experienced was hallucinatory. But partly that's because we're better at treating these things than we used to. But that being said, there are cases when people don't have insight into their condition. Now, I'm just trying to find where it is. Bear with me a moment, because I can't remember which section I put it in. No, I think it was when I look at give comparative miracle claims. So there's a very interesting case of, here we go, complicated bereavement. Yes. So this is on page 296 to 297 of my book. I cite a few cases that I've been able to document particularly. There are others as well. Of course, the thing is, many of these cases will be treated as mental health conditions and won't be made public. So we probably don't have a lot of these cases. We only get the ones that are released as case reports and that I was able to find. But here's a few that I'll mention. Case report of an elderly woman who continued to believe that her son was alive for 35 years after his death. She was not otherwise diagnosed with mental illness. Quoting from the report, on mental status examination, her high mental functions were intact. When asked about her son, she said she could not talk about him, but requested us to arrange for his return. So she thought he was still alive, but had gone off somewhere after 35 years. That was one that a case report was written about, possibly because she was not actually diagnosed with anything. She just seemed to have this one delusion. And I think in there they also talk about how she heard him talking or something like that. You can see the citation for more details. Another one, case report of a 26-year-old businessman who believed that his mother, who had died 6 months previously, was visiting and talking to him for extended periods of time every day. No mental illness or organic pathology was identified. They report, quote, the patient described seeing his mother regularly, almost every evening at different times. According to him, his mother would appear in different dresses that she used to wear when alive and would not allow him to touch her. The patient firmly believes that his mother appears to him in the real world. He does not accept that dead people do not return to Earth, but attributes this... he does accept that dead people do not return to Earth, but attributes this exception to a strong bond with his mother, end quote. Here's another example that I'm going to give, which is more of a cultural practice from Oman, called Mugayeb, probably mispronounced that, an Omani culturally sanctioned bereavement process in which relatives ardently deny that the deceased is really dead and hold expectations of their imminent return. Quote, this is on page 297, grieving the deceased by the family, friends, and acquaintances seems to indicate their acceptance of the reality of the loss. However, they continue to believe that the individuals are still alive. They are, therefore, expected to rise from the grave, move around to lead a shadowy existence, sleeping naked in a cave during the day and rising at night to wander the countryside, feeding on leaves and performing the orders of the magician, the master or the controller. I don't know what that refers to. During this period, the dead may be seen as a wraith-like figure at night by their family and friends. Alternatively, some individuals may be reported as being seen normally clothed during the daylight, in rapidly passing cars or in other situations, not easily amenable to verification, end quote. So these are some examples that I uncovered. And note that these are not really mental illness cases, which is probably why we have them, because I suspect that if they were attributed as such, then it's probably less likely that they'd be reported because of confidentiality and other factors. So there are cases of complicated bereavement when people don't gain insight into their condition and the fact that their hallucinations are hallucinations. And indeed, this even occurs in mentally healthy people. It probably also occurs in other people who we would subsequently identify as mentally ill. We don't know if any of the disciples had a mental illness or what we would now call a mental illness. It's quite plausible that some of them did. We don't know. That doesn't mean that they're all schizophrenic. There's a spectra of mental illnesses, right? So it's plausible that they did and that contributed, but we don't necessarily know. So this statement here is just false. And I think that it's important that Christians in responding to this sort of acknowledge that, do research and not just assert these things without knowing the fact of the matter, that there are cases of this. There are probably lots more that I haven't encountered. These are just some that I've found out about. Also, a further point that I want to make here is that it's not like the disciples were experiencing these hallucinations in a modern, secular, scientific, often Western middle class or even working class environment where we don't generally grant credence to people coming back from the dead. Even then, there are some people who hold on to these beliefs. But the disciples were experiencing these in a highly emotionally fraught new religious movement context where who they believe their savior and Messiah had just been killed. They were trying to make sense of that. So, of course, that's going to have a bearing on how they interpreted their experiences. It's not going to be the same as someone, just in a middle-class setting in the Western scientific post-Enlightenment world who experiences the same thing. So it's a bit strange to make that comparison because the context is so different. And Christians are usually very ready to point that out. They say, well, God is more likely to want to resurrect Jesus because of the religious context of his life and his teachings and so forth. Well, how come that context is not relevant when we're assessing whether it's likely that his disciples would have come to believe on the basis of hallucinations and attribute them to their reality? I think it's exactly that context that led them to infer that their hallucinations were veridical and that they were actually seeing Jesus. So I don't think that's a very good objection. All right, but he thinks that's busted. Okay, let's move on. Group religious experiences. So I assume this is a quote from my book or something. I'm not exactly clear what that's referring to. But yeah, so the point is I'm not saying that people shared a hallucination because I think a hallucination is a private experience. It's a mental experience. Rather, what I'm arguing is that hallucinations triggered group religious experiences, which may have included individual hallucinations, but it's not like the multiple people were sharing the same hallucination. This would be analogous to I can't share someone else's dream, as apologists like pointing out. But what can happen is if I tell them, hey, I had this weird dream, and then maybe they go and they have a similar dream, and then we talk about it later, and then we come to think that we're dreaming about the same thing, even if we're not literally having the same dream. That's an analogy. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but it could have been what happened in this particular case. Anyway, the quote tries to downplay that visions will be so alike that they couldn't tell the differences. No, I do have evidence. Maybe the quote didn't have evidence, but I do cite evidence for this. I'll read out some quotes in a moment. All of these shared hallucinations. So I'm saying they're shared religious experiences, not shared hallucinations, brought on by some shared expectations, don't occur at the same time. Well, how do we know that? They may have. Again, I'll get to that. Again, if one person caught up in some supposed religious ecstasy starts shouting, I see Jesus, he's over there. Other people won't see him. We'll get to that. They may say, I see him too, but over here. And none of them would report seeing the same person speaking the same words, eating the same foods, and being touched in the same way. Okay, I think I'll comment on that and then get to the next paragraphs here. So again, this is a common objection. The idea is that, okay, so maybe you could have the disciples simultaneously hallucinating, but they're not going to hallucinate the same thing. It's going to be different. They're going to recognize the differences. They're going to realize that they're hallucinating. They're going to abandon their beliefs. They're going to reject the Messiah, and they're going to go home. Yeah, that's not how it happened. Okay, so first of all, we know that collective religious experiences are a widespread phenomenon. I cite some examples. Well, not just examples of them, but I actually cite some psychological and sociological studies analyzing how they work, how they're produced, the mechanisms behind them. They're a fascinating phenomena, I think, that requires far more research. So I'll just read a few quotes out from some of the studies that I cite on this. I just got to find the right ones. Yeah, social construction of miracles. So page 276, I'm going to read a quote from psychologist Donovan Rawcliffe. Quote, the same factors which operate for a single individual in the induction of hallucinations become even more effective in an excited or expectant crowd, and on occasion may result in mass hallucinations. Now, I don't think it's good to call them that. I think it's better to call them collective experiences, but let's move on. Continuing the quote, this is not to say that any two people are capable of having precisely the same hallucination, identical in every respect, but similar preconceptions and expectations can undoubtedly result in hallucinatory visions so alike that subsequent comparisons will not disclose any major discrepancy. Dissimilar hallucinatory experiences often attain a spurious similarity by a process of harmonization in subsequent recollection and conversation, end quote. And that's precisely what I think happened. That's why we have the B, the biases, and the S, the socialization, as part of the model, because I think that those are critical elements in harmonizing these collective experiences. Let me read a few more quotes. Let's see. Okay, quote, this is from page 277 of my book. The communal creation of religious meaning is here examined in the context of an Irish Catholic charismatic prayer meeting. Through a microanalysis of the spontaneous ritual language of one such meeting, various discursive strategies are revealed which function to create for the participants an experience of divine human communication. These include an explicit effort on the part of speakers to construct a thematically consistent and coherent ritual event out of a sequence of apparently spontaneous individual speech acts, as well as marked use of evidentials to attribute spiritual authorship and authority to personal speech acts, end quote. I'm pretty sure that's referring to glossolalia, so speaking in tongues. I have to check that. The point is that basically what happens, and they document this, is how, someone will say something like in tongues, and then they'll attribute that to a divine source, and then that triggers someone else to say something, and then that's attributed to a divine source as well, and they begin to build a narrative about it. And this all includes in a context of expectation. There's often music or dancing or other things that are happening, or just also a shared community. And so they build this experience iteratively as it occurs. This is, I think, what happened with the disciples. They were praying, they were fasting, they were reading the scriptures, they were trying to understand what happened. And they already had, I think, the empty tomb, plus individual hallucinations. And they were trying to make sense of this. Like, well, okay, so they saw Jesus, but why? What happened? Why was the tomb empty? What's going on? Why did you die when we didn't expect? And they're reading the Old Testament. And all of that contributed to the experiences they had, and which then they interpreted through a process, which I think took days to weeks, as the resurrection. That's how they came up on the resurrection. It's not just they experienced a hallucination and then they decided it was the resurrection. It's all this put together, and the group religious experiences are constructed, not deliberately, not like in the sense of falsification, but they think that's how you access the divine, right? They think that there are things you do to access the divine and have these experiences. It turns out that these are actually what you do in order to elicit, I think, cognitive biases and memory distortions and suggesting experiences in others and invoking hallucinations and so on. But they thought these are the things that they did to answer their questions and get access to the divine. I think that these are the things that they did to unknowingly develop these beliefs in themselves and trigger these experiences. All right, let's move on to the next paragraph. There's an even deeper problem. The disciples were not continuing to have some sort of mass religious meetings where they chanted or did drugs or worked themselves into a state of religious fervor. Even after Mary and the other women reported Jesus missing and having seen angels, and even after Peter and John confirmed the tomb was empty, they were not expecting to see Jesus again. They were living in a state of terror at being arrested and murdered themselves. When that imminent threat had passed, they didn't keep waiting around singing hymns and praises in expectation of seeing Jesus. They went back to their old lives as if nothing had ever happened. Peter and James and John went back to their fishing, their careers they did before they were called by Jesus. And when they saw Jesus, they didn't even believe it was him at first. They were not primed to see risen Jesuses everywhere. The assumption was that the woman's testimony was enough to cause them to live in expectation of seeing Jesus themselves is an unfounded assumption made to force the group religious experience hypothesis to have any chance of being seen as credible. Okay, the next part moves on to James and Paul. So I'll respond to this paragraph here. So again, there's more yellow brick road apologetics here because there's more things that I don't necessarily accept. The idea that, for example, Peter and James and John went back to fishing. I think that's only reported in John, if I recall correctly. And I mean, even if it was reported in multiple gospels, I still wouldn't necessarily take that as fact. That's a classic thing that could be inserted later as just, well, what were the so there's an account of the apostles seeing Jesus, okay, but in the tradition, they didn't necessarily have exactly what was happening at the time. So the gospel writers are going to interpolate a bit, provide some context. This was a readily accepted practice in ancient times. What are they going to have the apostles doing when they see Jesus? Well, they knew that the Peter and so forth were fishermen, so let's have them fishing, right? It's so easy to see how that is that's added to the story later, if it wasn't already initially. I mean, I don't know, it might have been. But the point is, I don't necessarily accept, and I don't accept all of these details. They're not minimal facts. What basis is given for them to be taken as historical? Putting that then to the side, not necessarily putting that to the side, but just building on that, I guess, we don't know that Mary and the other women reported, we don't know that after they reported Jesus missing and having seen the angels, that Peter and John were not expecting to see Jesus again. How do you know what they were expecting to see? I don't even think that the Gospels make that clear. It does say in some cases that the disciples were skeptical and that they doubted before they saw. I think that that's best accounted for as the motif of prior skepticism, which I discuss in my book as well. So let's see if I can find that. This is a very common motif that you see in paranormal accounts as well as other religious accounts. Here it is. Yeah, avowal of prior skepticism. That's what it's called. Just trying to find where I have a quote about that. Here it is. Yeah. So this is on page 271 of my book. I'm quoting from psychologist Anna Stone. Quote, "The avowal of prior skepticism is a narrative device designed to enhance the credibility of the narrator and the likelihood of attribution of the event to a paranormal cause. The technique works like this. A typical narrative account starts with an avowal of prior skepticism. At first I was skeptical, followed by a description of an anomalous experience, but a psychic told me things she could not have known, which in turn is followed by a conversion. I realized something out of the ordinary was occurring. This technique highlights the strength of the evidence that caused the change in the narrator's attitude from initial skepticism to belief. By highlighting the narrator's reliance on evidence, the account also positions the narrator as a as a rational thinker, end quote. So I think that this very readily explains why we see these motifs in the Gospels and elsewhere, because we don't really have any other indication, apart from these motifs, which specifically relate to these appearances, that the disciples were very skeptical. I mean, the classic example I like to give of this is when Peter and whoever else was fishing, and Jesus comes up and he says, leave your nets and follow me. And they just leave their nets and follow him. Like, they didn't seem to require any miracles or other evidence there, unless you say that they already had experienced those and believed, but then we're just waiting for him. I don't know. That seems pretty ad hoc. That's certainly not the account, that the basis that seems to be not what the account's trying to say there. It seems to be that they're great faith, even though that they didn't know much about Jesus. And there don't seem to be other cases throughout the Gospels where they're exhibiting really strong skepticism or requiring strong evidence. So I think this is actually quite ad hoc to say that they were skeptical. The only basis are these avowals of prior skepticism, which I think are better accounted for as a narrative device, because it's very well known that this is used as a narrative device elsewhere. And also in the Gospels, a few of which explicitly say that they're designed to convince people to believe in Jesus. The end of John says that, and the start of, is it Luke or Matthew says that? I forget. So they're going to use these persuasive devices. Okay, let's see what else here. So I don't accept that they were not expecting to see Jesus. I think that after the empty tomb and the initial appearances, they were expecting to see Jesus, or expecting to have some sign at least. They may be living in a state of terror. I don't know how that rules out the fact that they're engaging in religious meetings. What do you think they were doing? Of course they were engaging in religious meetings and trying to work out what happened. Their Messiah had just died. They need to figure out what's going on. They're not just going to go home. And I think that this is actually a good point to talk about what happens when prophecy fails. So there's a very famous study that's been done by, I think, was it Festinger? I think I'm going to get his name wrong if I don't look it up. About I think it was a book called When Prophecy Fails. So he looked at new religious movements when they made prophecies which failed, and what happens to the movements there. Does everyone abandon their belief and go home? In fact, that's not what happens. So hang on, I just need to find the right citation. Yeah, that is not what happens. Some people typically will, experience doubts and leave, but certainly not everyone. And there are a number of, techniques or mechanisms that are at work to prevent that from happening. So let me just find it here. 441, where is it? Here we go. So, okay, so this particular quote is not from that specific book here. So the original study was, I think, a review of so I'm just getting the right section here. So this is an example of what's called irrational belief persistence. So this particular study, which I think was the Festinger study, reviewed 13 religious groups that made falsified prophecies and found that 12 of those survived the failure of the specific prophecies. So a large majority of cases where there are falsified prophecies in new religious movements, the movement survives. So people typically don't just go home. So that is inconsistent with the evidence we have. And one example of this was the Jehovah's Witnesses, whose multiple failed predictions of the end of the world are a good example of this, I think, in the late 19th century. Another example was in 1844, which is called the Great Disappointment, following a failed prediction of the Millerites that Jesus would return in that year. Now, how do they make sense of this? Well, I'm going to quote here from religious scholar J. Gordon Melton, who describes a process called spiritualization. Quote, the prophesied event is reinterpreted in such a way that what was supposed to have been a visible, verifiable occurrence is seen to have been, in reality, an invisible spiritual occurrence. The event occurred as predicted only on a spiritual level. End quote. So that's a very common reaction, and I think you do see this in that the idea of Jesus as a Messiah was the idea of what a Messiah was reinterpreted from being a political leader who would, on earth, in this life, lead Israel to freedom and restore the kingdom and so forth. It was reinterpreted from being that, which was the original understanding of Messiah, to a Messiah who would lead them, to a spiritual new life rather than a physical one. And so I think that's exactly the process you see in the understanding of the Messiah. And the resurrection was part of that, because the resurrection is understood to be, the death and resurrection of Jesus was understood to be a critical role in that. Whereas the expectation was that Jesus would not die. So it's a falsified prediction in that sense, because they expected him to restore the kingdom. He didn't do that, so how to make sense of it? They spiritualized it by understanding, yes, Jesus did triumph and did restore the kingdom, but on a spiritual level, by conquering death, right? So this is exactly what happened here, and it happens in other religious movements as well. Okay, let's see. So I also discuss work of another scholar called Joseph. Oh, they're testing me with names today. Zygmunt. Yeah, Joseph Zygmunt. This is on page 313 of my book, who gives an account of a pattern followed by the Watchtower Society. I believe those are Joseph. Joseph, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Correct me if that's wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what they call themselves. So here's what happened. Firstly, there's an initial reaction by rank and file and the leaders, which was a combination of disappointment and puzzlement. This is what we see in the Gospels. They're disappointed, they're puzzled, they're despairing. There's an initial decline in proselytization, but members maintained an attitude of watchful waiting for predictions to materialize. The doctrinal basis for the prophecies were re-examined and conjectures offered as to why the expected events may be delayed. The group then asserts that the prophecies had in fact been partially fulfilled, or that there's some significance to what happened, such that it actually did transpire on the nominated dates, and belief was sustained that God's plan was continuing to unfold. Unfulfilled portions of the failed prophecies were projected into the future by issuing redacted predictions in associating with retrospective reinterpretation of earlier failures. The group engaged in a selective interpretation of newly developed historical events as confirmation of the signs of the approaching end, and so forth. So basically what happens is initially they're puzzled, they don't know what happens, they try to make sense of it, people are waiting, they're cautious, maybe some leave, but the majority are just trying to work out what's happened. Then they reinterpret the predictions and they provide a new justification for this by referring to their holy text. This is exactly what happens with Jesus' followers, okay? So even the Gospels preserve some account of this, even if I don't necessarily accept all the details. So initially, the disciples are shocked, they're dismayed, they're confused, they don't know what to make of it. Then they experience these appearances. This occurs as they're trying to make sense of it with each other. Why else are the disciples together? They just, you think that they were meeting together and that they just discussed the weather, to paraphrase, I think it was Habermas or someone who said that when Paul and Peter met in Jerusalem, that they were just discussing the weather, when, of course, they were discussing the gospel. You know, when the disciples were with each other, do you think they were discussing the weather? They think they've just forgotten about what happened? No, that's not what happens when people are part of new religious movements. They are dismayed. They are distraught. They love Jesus. They thought that he was going to, bring the new kingdom and so forth. They have to make sense of that. So as part of meeting together, they discuss that and they work out by referring to existing scriptures, that is the Old Testament, that Jesus was actually fulfilling these prophecies, of the suffering servant and so forth, and that he would, and that they look to Jonah and other passages, that he's going to die and rise on the third day. That combined with the individual hallucinations and the empty tomb that I think that already were prompting, were sort of providing background for their experiences here, led them to their belief, and also the experiences that they had. So I think all of that fits together with studies of how other new religious movements respond to failed prophecies, and how other religious movements in other contexts also instigate collective experiences. It all fits together with what we know happened to the apostles just after Jesus' death. The only thing we can't make sense of, again, is the particularities of the gospel appearance accounts. But we don't have to accept those as historical, and I don't accept those as historical. I think those were later embellishments and legendary developments, and partly product of false memories and other things as well. Okay, so I think this is all in saying that I don't think it's true to say that they were primed to see Jesus' appearance. I think they were primed, and I think I've discussed the mechanisms of that. I don't think it's an unfounded assumption. I've just given a lot of reasons. I've given quotes, and I discuss more of them in my book about why this is a reasonable thing to expect, because that's what happens when prophecy fails. That's what happens when religiously excited people get together who are experiencing bereavement and who have had a trigger that leads them to expect this to happen. Yeah, I think that's quite plausible. Reginald points out that the apostles discussing the weather, Camille's theory, which is the Jesus being in the cloud theory, which, I mean, for all I know, could have been part of the experiences as well. Camille's theory is more parsimonious than mine, in a sense that it doesn't postulate all the same mechanisms, but I think that it's it can be easily reconciled. Well, it's not inconsistent with mine. It's just a potential experience that they had that led to this. Potentially, the appearance of the 500 could have been a pareidolia event in the sky. That's probably the most the closest fit to what we see reported in the Gospels. Oh, well, I guess that one's in Acts. No, Corinthians. Oh, wherever it's reported. I've forgotten now. Anyway, let's move on. The biggest problem is that this cannot explain the certainty. Okay, so now we move on to talk about James and Paul. So my account can't explain the certainty of James and Paul that they'd experienced the risen Jesus. They were skeptics at first, and in Paul's case, complete enemy. Paul was definitely not sitting around in expectation of seeing Jesus. He was going around seeking out false Jews to arrest, presided over stoning of Stephen. Jesus was James' half-brother who never believed Jesus was alive. Sorry, never believed in Jesus while Jesus was alive, but later was so convinced that Jesus was indeed risen from the dead, he became leader of the Jerusalem church. Okay, so there are 2 points here. One is about Paul, one is about James. So let's take them in that order. So let's talk about Paul. The RHBS model, as I said before, does not account for the appearance to Paul. I completely acknowledge this. It doesn't really say anything about Paul. Paul was not expecting to see a risen Jesus, as far as we can determine. He didn't even know Jesus. He was not one of his followers. He wasn't around with the disciples, etc. So the model doesn't account for him. Is that a problem? No, it's not a problem, because the resurrection hypothesis doesn't account for the appearance to and subsequent conversion of Paul either. I don't understand how Christians... I've never seen a Christian acknowledge this. Not a single Christian discussing this has ever acknowledged this. Either they don't discuss Paul, or they talk about his appearance as if it's accounted for by the resurrection narratives. So this is... I'm going to really call them out on this. This is just an intellectual embarrassment to not realize this key point, that the hypothesis is that Jesus, the God rose Jesus from the dead, as a vindication of Jesus's mission, right? Now, you need a further... So merely rising from the dead is vindication, okay? It doesn't follow that he's going to appear to anyone. I'll discuss that a bit more later. But you can postulate that Jesus will appear to his followers, people he knew, to further support the vindication and to let them know what happened to him. That's plausible, but it is a further assumption. Again, I'll discuss that a bit further. Well, I discuss it more in my book. I'll briefly mention that a bit more later. But I don't want to get distracted because we're talking about Paul. Paul was not one of Jesus' followers. So even if I say that Jesus wanted to appear to his followers to support that vindication, to let them know what happened to him, there's no reason he's going to appear to Paul. Paul's just some random dude years later who was persecuting Jesus and his initial followers. Why would Jesus want to appear to Paul? Let's think of it another way. Is a resurrection necessary for Jesus to appear to Paul? No, Jesus can appear to anyone at any time, whenever he wants to, because Jesus is God and God is omnipotent, okay? So it's not necessary. Is it sufficient? Not sufficient. It's not necessary for Jesus to be resurrected in order to appear to Paul, because, as I said, Jesus can appear to anyone at any time, regardless of whether he's resurrected. Does it follow from the fact that Jesus was resurrected that he would necessarily appear to Paul? So in other words, is it sufficient to say that because Jesus was resurrected that it follows that he would appear to Paul? Nate, no, this is not going to be that long a stream. Hopefully I'll be finishing up in a half hour or so, but it's all right. You'll see the recording up and you can finish listening to it then. I understand this is kind of late in US time. Unfortunately, the time when it's most convenient for me to record, which is during the day in my time, is either like very late or very early in US time, and likewise UK time. So I understand that it's not necessarily great for live viewing, but I had the opportunity now, so I thought I'd record this now. So I guess, yeah, for the West Coast, it's maybe a bit earlier. But anyway, so thanks for those who are sticking around. So what was I saying? Yeah, so is it sufficient to cite the fact that Jesus was resurrected to such that it would follow from that he would appear to Paul? Well, no, because of course Jesus could very well be resurrected without appearing to Paul. After all, why would he? There's just no connection there. The only reason we say that we think that Jesus would appear to Paul is because he did appear to Paul. But that's a problem, because that's just ad hoc assumption that we need to make, that Jesus has some reason for appearing to Paul. Otherwise, there's no explanatory, unless we make that ad hoc assumption, there's no explanatory force. Power, that's what I'm looking for. There's no explanatory power of the resurrection with respect to the Pauline appearance. Why would a resurrected Jesus, appear to Paul? There's no reason at all. We just have to stipulate that as a hypothesis. But then, of course, the atheist or skeptic can simply stipulate, oh, well, Paul had some sort of hallucinatory experience. Maybe he was mentally ill. Maybe it was schizophrenia. Maybe it was manic-induced hallucination. Maybe it was because he was working himself to the bone and he sort of fainted and had this experience looking up into the sun. The point is, all of these are ad hoc. I acknowledge we don't have any reason to postulate these other than to explain the fact that Paul did experience something. But they're no more or less ad hoc than postulating that the resurrected Jesus wanted to appear to Paul. We can assess whether one is more plausible than the other. I would say that saying that Jesus wanted to appear to Paul is extremely ad hoc, because how many other people did the resurrected Jesus appear to outside of his followers? As far as we know, 0. Well, maybe the appearance of the 500, but we don't really know who those were. Either way, it's not very, especially if you take it outside the Pentecost period, which is also very significant because Paul's appearance occurred outside of this sort of set of canonical appearances, which is like the resurrection appearances, and then Jesus went up to heaven, right? Also, Paul's appearance seems to have been more of a vision than a bodily appearance, because his followers couldn't Paul's companions couldn't see everything, although they maybe heard the voice, so it's a bit ambiguous there. So the point is, it's clearly of a different nature to the other resurrection appearance, a different time, different place, different set of people. So how many other people did Jesus appear to outside of the 40-day period? The answer seems to be 0, at least if you restrict yourself to the canonical accounts. Of course, if you believe the Book of Mormon, then Jesus actually also appeared to people in the Americas, although that was during the 3-day period when he was before he was resurrected, actually. But the point is that anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that Mormons think that Jesus appeared to people in the Americas, and I'm pretty sure there are many other appearances in non-canonical Gospels and other accounts. But if you restrict yourself to canonical sources, there's literally one person that Jesus appeared to outside of the 40-day period as a bona fide kind of appearance, and that is to Paul. So that seems to have a very low plausibility to me. Jesus is not in the business of appearing to people, so it's pretty implausible that he would have done so in any particular case. Whereas hallucinations or manic delusions or fainting spells that then trigger hallucination, whatever I think it was, those are also rare, especially ones that lead to dramatic conversions, but they do happen. And I do cite, I'm pretty sure it's in my book, although it possibly is on my blog, because I think it may be on my blog, actually, because I don't talk about Paul in my book, I think. This is the trouble. When you write lots of things, you can't actually remember what you wrote where, so you get a bit puzzled. But anyway, memory contamination, memory bias, right? But anyway, so the point is, those things are rare, but they do happen. Whereas appearances outside of even on Christian theology, right? Appearances outside the 40-day period, basically there's one of them. So I think that it's actually more plausible to suggest, to make an ad hoc suggestion of a sort of hallucination-triggered conversion than it is to postulate this ad hoc and apparently for no rhyme or reason appearance of Jesus to Paul. So the point that I want to make there is one that I'm going to ram home, and I think that skeptics really need to push harder. The resurrection does not explain the appearance to Paul. Saying that Jesus just wanted to appear to Paul is ad hoc. So if the Christians allowed an ad hoc assumption, the atheist is allowed an ad hoc assumption as well, and they can just ad hoc make an assumption that there was some sort of hallucination that triggered that. Okay, now let's talk about James. James, the brother of Jesus, is reported in one of the Gospels, I forget which, as being, well, actually the family of Jesus is reported generally as not believing him. Now, I could just say that's not true and they always believed him. That's not one of the minimal facts, so I don't have to accept that. But let's say some actually insert that James was skeptical as a minimal fact. I don't think there's really good historical evidence for that. But I don't think it's that implausible. So let's say James was a skeptic and then later he was a believer. This is the point that I keep making, and I'm also not seeing an apologist acknowledge. This is post hoc ergo propter hoc reasoning. That means after this, therefore because of this. Just because, what's a good example of this? Just because, just because our stream ending after the fact that, people had dinner in my house, after that the stream ended. That doesn't mean that people having dinner in my house caused their stream to end, the other night when we did the 10-hour stream. Dumb example. It's just the first thing I could think of. But it's a basic point. If something happens after something else, it doesn't mean that the first thing caused it, right? You'd think this is a pretty basic point, but somehow apologists don't see it when it comes to the conversion of James. Okay, so what we've got, we've got first, there's a flipped left right thing here, so I've got to be careful. First, we have James is a skeptic. Then later we have James is a believer. At some point, it's unknown when that happened, James apparently experienced an appearance of Jesus. So what is the assumption here is that they're assuming that the appearance to Jesus came before the conversion and therefore caused the conversion. But I'm saying we have no basis for that, and that's an ad hoc assumption. Just as likely, the appearance came after James converted. So I don't think I said that as clearly as I wanted to. So we know that there are 3 events. James, let me say this again. James not believing, James being converted at some point, and then James being in charge of, what is it? The Jerusalem church, leader of the Jerusalem church. So we know that those things happened in that succession, presumably. Disbeliever, converted, leader of the church. And somewhere in there, there's a experience of the risen Jesus. There's an appearance. And they're assuming that the appearance occurred the conversion occurred because of the appearance, but we don't know that at all. Just because he was converted doesn't mean that it occurred because of the appearance. I think that it's probably the other way around. There was a conversion and then later there was an appearance. So just because he did convert doesn't mean that you can assume that it was due to the that it was due to the to an appearance. That's just, the Gospels don't even say that. That's just entirely made up. All right, so I think I've responded to that. So summary, RHBS doesn't explain Paul, but neither does the resurrection. I don't need to explain the conversion of James because I don't necessarily even acknowledge it as a minimal fact, but if I do take it as a minimal fact, I just assert that he converted for other reasons and then had an experience. All right. Okay, let's move on to, so that's busted as well. Let's move on to number 4, memory and cognitive biases. So he thinks these are more plausible than some of the others, which is fine, but not why original auditory visual hallucinations themselves take on a physical character. Well, that's because of the memory and cognitive biases. I mean, I discussed that, right? I'm not going to go through those here. Have a look at the book for many citations I have on that. Why the details such as Jesus eating, Thomas touching, and why the two going home the road, why Peter and James caught a little boatload of fish while they realized it was Jesus, why Jesus had fire built for them, why they cooked and ate fish. None of these specific visual details can be explained by people's individual hallucinations being compared and Jesus converging into one shared narrative. At best, a similar visionary experience might be expected to have come about that way. Not these types of details could have come, not these types of details that could be, can't read this, not these type of details that could not be part of any individual vision. Okay, so any of these things could have been part of an individual vision. Why can't you hallucinate someone, you touching someone or someone eating fish, right? It's really bizarre. It's like, yeah, you can hallucinate seeing someone, but don't try to tell me you can hallucinate seeing someone eating fish. That's just too far out, right? But anyway, also, this is more yellow brick road apologetics. I don't acknowledge that any of these specifics necessarily occurred. I'm trying to account for individual and then later collective group experiences of the risen Jesus in multiple locations and with different specifics. I'll even grant that, but not any of these specifics necessarily. If I already believed all of these things, I would already believe basically everything it says in the gospel. So why not just believe that it says Jesus is Christ? Why the need for these arguments? I mean, I guess this guy's not necessarily giving me an argument. He's responding to my argument. But the thing is, if he's just going to say, hey, I believe what the Gospels say, then he could just avoid all of this by saying, I believe the Gospels when it says Jesus was the Christ and that's all there is to it. In which case I would say, fine, you can do that. The RHBS model is not saying anything about that. The RHBS model is responding to a minimal facts argument for the historicity of the resurrection. It's not trying to respond to someone who just believes for other reasons or as a matter of faith or whatever, right? So if this guy or other people making these objections are willing to just believe what the Gospels say as a matter of faith or for other reasons, then fine, they can do that. The RHBS model doesn't touch them. However, if they do believe it because of a minimal facts or similar argument, then it doesn't make sense for them to pull in these details here because then that's not a minimal facts argument. Those haven't been established as minimal facts. And certainly someone like me as a skeptic is not just going to grant those as minimal facts. Why should I accept all of those things really happened? My argument is precisely that those things developed over time, possibly in response to individual hallucinations, possibly they were part of the group experiences, possibly they weren't part of the original experiences, but developed later through memory contamination, cognitive biases, socialization, and other factors. Again, I'll just refer to my book there. I won't quote those here because there's quite a lot of them. And this is another instance where we come back to what I said initially. I can't give a narrative as to how the stories ended up this way. I can't say, well, Peter experienced this particular thing and then spoke to Thomas, who then told him about this other thing, and then Peter thought about it for a week, and then he spoke to John, who then said this thing, and then his memory was contaminated. I can't say that because we don't have the details. All I can point to is general factors and talk about plausibilities of memories becoming biased and contaminated and so forth, which I think is sufficient to explain the facts that we have, but I can't give a narrative for that. That's why it's never going to be as persuasive in that sense. That's why we need to really be careful and realize that what we're looking for is a good explanation, not a persuasive narrative, because they're very different things. Or at least they can be very different things. All right, let's move on to number 5. Wait, did number 4 get busted? Oh, we still rated it as busted. Okay, yeah, just had to check that. All right, number 5 here. Socialization, marginalisation of doubt. This would be somewhat plausible were it not for the fact that these people were under severe persecution, first from Jewish leaders, faced being expelled from synagogue minimum or even death if they were to accept Christian claims of Jesus being resurrected or that he was the Messiah. Then Roman persecution took over and the Jews were expelled, Jerusalem destroyed. It took real courage to convert, which means that people were not going to convert to Christianity unless they were completely convinced it was true. I mean, I think that they were convinced it was true, right? So we agree with that. Those already in it may have felt pressure to conform, but they would not explain anyone coming to Christianity. Which did indeed happen, including in Jerusalem and Judea, where the events were most easily proven falsely fabricated or products of mere hallucination. It doesn't even really explain the conversion of Gentiles who fell away. Again, they stood to lose social standing, friends, etc. If Jewish, they were still kicked out of the synagogue. If Gentile, they were ostracized by the Gentiles. Socialization, marginalization, left out can only explain why current Christians chose not to speak out, not why anyone would be willing to convert. So the socialization, marginalization, left out is not supposed to explain why later people converted to Christianity. That's a whole other discussion. What I'm trying to, yeah, no worries. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. What this is trying to explain is why the initial Christians, particularly basically I'm talking about the disciples, so the 11, I suppose, maybe some of the women followers and other early hangers-on, were convinced and came to preach the resurrection. I'm not really trying to explain why later people in Judea or Jerusalem or Corinth or Athens or Rome or wherever else became converted, because that's a whole different story. Socialization factors would have been relevant there, but so would have all these psychological and longing and finding meaning and all these other factors. That's a different discussion. I'm not trying to explain that. Again, there needs to be a focus here. What am I trying to explain with the RHBS model? I'm trying to explain the minimal facts. I'm not trying to explain why people converted later. That's not the same question. Okay, but some other points here. So they were under severe persecution. So we don't actually know that the disciples were initially, when I say initially, I mean like first few weeks, maybe to months. We don't know that they were then under severe persecution. I suspect that they went underground because they didn't want to be arrested or potentially in trouble either. But I don't think that there's any reason why they would have been sought out. Certainly the Romans would have had no interest in doing that as long as there was no further disturbances to the peace. Even the Jewish leaders, I don't think would have been too interested, because they thought that take out the leader and the others will just scatter and won't be much of a problem, right? Even if they continued to believe, it wouldn't have mattered as long as they didn't keep, doing things like bursting into the temple and disrupting it, assuming that actually did happen. And I think that, I'm trying to remember, did the Jesus seminar think that that was historical, right? I don't know. I forget. But anyway, if that happened, that's the sort of thing the Jewish leaders certainly didn't want happening. They didn't want people saying that they were the Messiah or preaching blasphemies. But so that's what Jesus was doing. They thought that if they get rid of Jesus, then the disciples, well, who cares about them? There'll be no issue. So I don't think the early disciples, that is, at least in the first weeks to maybe months, were under persecution, even by the Jewish authorities. Now, obviously later they were, because you see Paul and others, but that's later. That's a few years later. It's very important to think about the narrative clearly here. And many apologists are not clear about the narrative when they're objecting to these things. They say, well, yes, they were persecuted. But when were they persecuted? Were they persecuted in the first few weeks? I don't think that they were. I mean, even if they were, it doesn't really change it that much. I just think it's important to keep things under perspective. So I don't think that the disciples were being like rooted out and hunted down. I don't think there's any reason to think that. And it seems like it would be a lot of work for the authorities for very little purpose. And certainly it's not a minimal fact, so I'm just not going to accept it. So I think that they were primarily concerned with understanding why Jesus died, making sense of that, fitting that with their beliefs about him being the Messiah and so forth, as well as making sense of the empty tomb and the individual hallucinations. Obviously, they didn't think of them as hallucinations, but I think they were hallucinations. That's what they were concerned about doing. They developed a belief in the resurrection as a result of that process over a few weeks, maybe to months, and also as a result of collective experiences they had while undergoing that. The fact that they may or may not have been under persecution during this time is irrelevant. That may have only intensified their desire to work out what happened because they're sort of cut off from the rest of the world. But I mean, either way, I think it's plausible. Pretty much all new religious movements undergo persecution. Look at Mormons, for example. They were under very severe persecution pretty much from the whole time until they got to Utah. Now, persecution by the Romans later on was sporadic and not really relevant because this is way after the initial beliefs developed, which is what I'm trying to explain here. Now, this claim here, people were not going to convert to Christianity unless they were completely convinced it was true. I mean, I think that the disciples were probably completely convinced. I think probably that some of them did have doubts initially, but I think that the socialization and marginalization of doubt did away with those. They would have thought that they were sinners, or that they just couldn't see, or that they just needed more time to think about it. They wouldn't have talked about it. They would have experienced memory contamination and other effects that led them to believe what other people were saying. So I think that I can account for these factors without needing to postulate, like real supernatural miracles. And so that caused them to become truly convinced. It's like this point about the persecution. It's like the Christians think the atheists think that the disciples were making all this up. I don't think that we need to postulate that at all. I think they were sincere. It's just they convinced themselves that it was true. Not that they had objectively good reasons. They had persuasive but not justificatory reasons. Another way to say this is that they developed a persuasive narrative to themselves which implied that Jesus had risen and had been resurrected, right? That doesn't mean they had good evidence. So we've got to distinguish those. They were convinced, but they didn't have sufficient reasons, in my opinion, or according to this model. Okay, so I think I've responded to all of this. I'm not trying to explain the conversion of Gentiles later on. Okay. No one would convert unless they were already convinced beyond a reasonable doubt they were indeed true. Well, his disciples were already converted, although they didn't see themselves as like Christians at that point. They saw themselves as Jews. So it's a bit anachronistic to talk about like converting to Christianity at this point. But insofar as we can call these like proto-Christians, the disciples and women followers and others were already that. So I'm not saying that they were not converted by their experiences. They had the experiences because they already believed and were trying to make sense of it. All right, so there's a little bit more here at the end. Oops. Analysis of the resurrection of apostles. Let me twice say up front, it's clearly biased in finding implausible ways to call it implausible, huh? Oh, to call the resurrection hypothesis implausible. Now, this claim here is interesting, saying that my account is biased. I mean, I've never pretended to be unbiased. As a general rule, don't trust anyone who says that they're unbiased. Not about anything like this, at least. Not like anything important, philosophical or religious or political or really anything like that. Maybe you could be unbiased about what cereal you should eat or something like that. But if anyone says that they're unbiased, don't trust them because they're not intellectually honest. Maybe they're even deceiving themselves that they're unbiased. But because no one is unbiased, right? No one is this sort of impartial observer from nowhere who just responds completely rationally to all facts and doesn't have an axe to grind or doesn't have preconceptions or anything like that. Of course I'm biased, right? And especially because I'm setting myself out to construct a naturalistic account. So I'm deliberately going to find a naturalistic way to explain things. That's what I'm trying to do. That's the point of this exercise. The point of this exercise is not to unbiasedly try to find what I think actually happened historically. I think that what I'm saying probably is close to what happened historically, but it's a slightly different project. The project is Christian apologists like Craig say that naturalists cannot explain the minimal facts. I'm saying challenge accepted. Let's see if naturalists can explain the minimal facts. So I'm setting out to try to do that. Then what I expect to happen is other atheists, other skeptics, but particularly Christians, for obvious reasons, I want them to look at my account and say, and weigh it up on the basis of the criteria for evaluating explanations and see how good is it. Obviously, I evaluate it as quite good, but I'm biased there, so that's not sufficient, right? I need other people, especially people who are going to be hostile to this sort of project, to tell me how good it is and evaluate it on the criteria. And that's part of the discussion we have. We go back and forth, we discuss it. Hopefully we learn and grow together. And that's what I'm genuinely interested in here. That's why I do appreciate these written responses, although I think that they're generally misinformed or not really seeing the point. But nevertheless, I do appreciate the engagement, and that's why I wanted to make this response here. Sorry, where was I going with that? Yeah, so the idea that it's biased. So I'm not trying to present this as an unbiased account. I'm presenting it as an attempt to respond to, provide an account of the minimal facts. And then we can see, because if naturalists can effectively explain the minimal facts, then we need to shift the debate. Then we need to say, well, maybe we need more minimal facts. Well, the Christians need more minimal facts, which they'd have to establish. Or perhaps they have to abandon those and try to establish the reliability of the Gospels more broadly. Or perhaps the whole project of trying to establish this on historical criteria is flawed and they need to rethink how you can establish Christianity, which I tend to think is probably true. But so I don't pretend to be unbiased, and I don't even think that's the right lens to look at that. I try to be fair when I'm evaluating things and give reasons for what I say, but that's different from being unbiased. All right, now, I say, this is coming back to something I said before about the resurrection hypothesis is not actually itself a very good hypothesis. First of all, you have to assume that Jesus wanted to or had a reason to appear to his followers after he was raised, because that doesn't follow for him being raised. And that's what I say here. Unless we have private knowledge of God's intention, doesn't follow that anyone would see a reason Jesus. So he says, except we do have prior knowledge. Jesus himself told his disciples that not only was he going to die, he would be resurrected, and that his disciples would see him again. So there's a quote there, which I'm not going to read from John. So I think that people watching this video know what I'm going to say about that. That's yellow brick road apologetics. Okay, I don't accept that Jesus said that he was going to be killed and raised again. I think he probably did predict his death. I mean, going around blaspheming left, right, and center, it's not unlikely that you're going to be killed at some point. So I do actually expect that he probably did predict that. Whether he predicted he would rise again is interesting. I think it's actually possible that he did. But the problem is, if Jesus predicted that he would be resurrected, then it becomes way easier to explain why the disciples believe that he would be resurrected, because Jesus said so. So apologists don't usually like to argue that, because it completely undercuts their argument that, like, well, you need these massive, super miraculous appearances to convince them that he'll be resurrected, because it goes against the Jewish context and they weren't expecting a resurrected Messiah and so on. But if you believe this, then all of that goes out the window. Well, no, they just believe what Jesus said. Maybe they were skeptical at first when Jesus said he was going to be resurrected, but after he died and then the tomb was found empty, then, well, of course they believe that he was resurrected. So my job gets way easier if Jesus actually did predict his resurrection, because, of course, then that would explain why they came to belief in it, and everything fits together even easier. So, Zachary, well, I mean, it has been a few days since the recording, but, can't never get enough counter apologetics. But actually, I've been meaning to do this one for a while, so that's one of the reasons I was like, yeah, I need to get this done, because I did say I'd do it to this person who sent me this, and I think it makes good follow up to that stream as well. Anyway, so yeah, the point is, if Jesus really did predict his resurrection, then the belief in the resurrection can become a self-fulfilling prophecy quite easily, and my job's way easier. So actually, apologists usually don't like to bring this up because it undermines their minimal facts point. But on the other hand, I just don't have to accept that Jesus did actually predict that he would be resurrected, and then again, I don't have to explain the fact that sort of how did he predict that. But I mean, again, it seems to just hurt the Christians, not really to hurt me in any way, because it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. And it's really hard for me to understand how a Christian like this guy, who's, I mean, I assume a reasonably intelligent guy, engage with this and think about the issues here. Most people won't even do that. To not see how the fact that if Jesus really did predict that he'd be resurrected, that just makes it super easy for me to then explain how the belief arose that he was resurrected. Yeah, I don't really understand that objection. It's very strange to not see that that's self-defeating. Moving to the next point, Jesus said, I would see you again, so there's no prior knowledge is not true. Again, I don't necessarily accept that, but if you do accept that, well, then we've got an explanation for the belief in the resurrection already pre-packaged and developed. The whole argument is silly anyways. Of course, we would expect to see Jesus. Of course, we would expect the disciples to see Jesus if God chose to raise him from the dead. Why wouldn't we expect that? Well, asking a question is not giving an argument, so that's not going to be sufficient. But there is some of an argument here. So what is God, some trickster who lets Jesus die, sends his closest friends into tailspins of despair, resurrects Jesus, but doesn't let the disciples know it? This is so patently ridiculous that it really goes to show how far forward is in reaching to find any reason. What is this? Forward? Come on. You could at least get my name right. Forward. I'm trying to zoom in, but Word doesn't do that well. Maybe I should just increase the size of this. You've seen it first here, folks. I'm going to change my name to, oh, come on, Forward. Here we go. Yep. It's exciting. I don't know why I find this so amusing. It's probably just one of the worst misspellings of my name that I've seen in quite a long time. I guess he missed it, like the D and the R got switched. Anyway, I've seen Frodo before and Fodor. That's reasonably common. Forward is a strange one to me. Okay, but I won't be too upset about that because I understand that, typing is hard. So anyway, why wouldn't we expect to see Jesus appear to his disciples after he was raised? Well, for a start, many of the early Gnostics didn't think that Jesus was, well, I mean, they didn't like the whole idea of a body, right? They thought the flesh was sort of evil and corrupted. So I don't think that they believed in appearances. At least some of them I don't think did. And so they didn't have reason to think that on their theology. If you read the earliest versions of Mark, they also don't have resurrection appearances. Even if you think that maybe there were stories, I mean, I think Mark probably knew that there were stories of resurrection appearances because certainly they predate Mark, right? But because Paul's heard of them. But the point is, it was at least conceivable to write a gospel that didn't have resurrection appearances at the end of it. So already there's sort of precedent for the idea that you don't have to just think that automatically there are going to be any appearances. Furthermore, we don't know what God's purposes were in resurrecting Jesus. When I say that, obviously Christians say, well, we know what they were. But the point is the resurrection hypothesis doesn't say anything about that. The resurrection hypothesis, as usually stated, just says God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate Jesus as a prophet, or to vindicate his mission. Nothing from that follows about exactly when or where Jesus would or would not appear following his resurrection. So you have to postulate that. It is an additional assumption. Maybe it's fairly plausible, but it's still an assumption that has to be added there. And I think that that's really important to mention, because If you think about it, the evidence that we have is really unexpected given a genuine resurrection. If God wanted to vindicate Jesus as the Messiah, then maybe you would expect him to appear to his followers, but you wouldn't only expect him to appear to his followers. You'd expect him to appear to Pontius Pilate, the Roman emperor, the Chinese emperor, the Persian emperor, people in the Americas, maybe the Australians, and they can paint some cave art of it, and the others, of course, can all write it down because they were literate cultures, and we'd have records from these cultures all dating to the 1st century from around the world of Jesus appearing to them and mentioning some basic precepts of the gospel. In that case, this whole book becomes unnecessary because the RHBS hypothesis, Camille's hypothesis, Pelagius' hypothesis, Richard Carrier's hypothesis, what's that guy who Gert Ludeman's hypothesis, all of these hypotheses go out the window because we have overwhelming evidence that Jesus really did appear, because there's no way that you can account for that naturalistically. These 1st century texts appearing in 4 different cultures and talking about the exact same thing, or very similar thing. That is what we would expect to see, something like that, if God was really raising Jesus from the dead to vindicate his mission. Why didn't God do that? God could have done that. Why not? Why does God make the evidence really lousy, such that all we have are these texts from some time later written by his supporters from one culture, not from many different cultures in a geographic dispersion that could not be explained naturalistically? God's really dropping the ball here because he could have made the evidence so much better. And the best counter I've ever heard to that is just, why am I not showing myself again? I'm making all these, I'm getting all excited and you're just seeing this document. The best explanation I've ever heard to account for that is that God needs to keep himself hidden sufficiently so that, we can still choose whether to believe in him or not. But this is the dumbest thing. This is just such a dumb response because, first of all, it assumes that you can choose what to believe, which is a view called belief voluntarism that Camille mentioned in the 10-hour discussion, and it's quite disputed. But second of all, even if you do believe that, it implies that if you believe that Jesus is God, or God raised Jesus, it automatically follows that you're going to have to support him and you're not going to have a choice in the matter, which is bizarre because you can still choose whether to support him or not. The Bible is filled with people who believe that Jesus, or not necessarily Jesus, but at least believe in God or see miracles, or including Jesus' miracles, right? And who don't believe, who attribute it to spirits or evil demons, or who do believe but don't care. Like what about the Israelites? When they have all of these miracles that God's done for them, and then Moses goes up, and then they decide to make a golden calf, because they, I don't know, get antsy or whatever. They lose their courage. It wasn't a question of not believing or not having enough evidence for them. It was a question of whether they were going to sort of endure through it and overcome their natural impulses or whatever. Now, I don't think that the story was historical, but all I'm saying is that it's just not biblical to say that if you believe, it's sufficient and will necessitate you always following God. So the whole free will argument makes no sense as to why God couldn't have provided better evidence. And I'm going to make a final point there, which I think I haven't made before, but should be made, is to that, let's suppose that if you truly believed that Jesus was God, then you would just be sufficiently motivated to always follow him, that free will wouldn't be an issue anymore. But then why would free will be important? Think of this. If all God had to do was prove beyond a shadow of doubt that, or even not a shadow of a doubt, like you can still have shadows of doubts, it's just proved, to a very high level, let's say 99% confidence, to prove 99% confidence that Jesus really rose from the dead. If that's all God had to do to ensure that everyone would always choose to follow him, then why wouldn't he do that? Like, why would that be, even if you think in some sense it violates free will, like, wouldn't that be a better way to go than like, nah, I got to hide myself, bruh, because, I don't want to make it too obvious because free will, bruh, am I right? Like, what? Why is free will important if God could do it that way? It seems that there would be an obviously better way of doing it. So the point is, for that to make sense, you have to believe in belief voluntarism, you have to believe free will is important, and you have to believe that somehow everyone's free will would be violated by the fact that there's good evidence, which is not what the Bible teaches. So this response is just pathetic. It's just a really bad response that's not at all slightly plausible. And therefore, and that's the only response that I've ever heard to this argument. Why didn't Jesus appear to more peoples around the world to make the evidence overwhelming so that people like me could never make these arguments? So I think the point I'm making here with respect to what's said in this document is that what we get in terms of appearances is not expected under the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead to divinely vindicate him. You have to make a hypothesis to why he wanted to appear to his disciples. Maybe he would have appeared to no one, right? Gnostics and others seem to have appeared that, maybe early Mark gospel. But also, why not appear to many more people? You have to hypothesize that he wanted to appear to these and just these people. And that is quite implausible, I think. And the resurrection hypothesis doesn't account for it. Now, the RHBS model accounts for it beautifully, because you wouldn't expect anyone other than the people who already were in that close-knit community to have these experiences. That's why the RHBS does not account for Paul's conversion. You have to hypothesize additional factors going on there, but of course that's true for the resurrection hypothesis as well. As I said, doesn't account for Paul. So, in conclusion, I don't think that that is a good objection of my model. So let me just summarize here. Again, I know that I tend to do longer streams. It's because I like to go into detail and explain things more thoroughly, so we can have a more genuine conversation and not just throw out, zingers. Although I'm going to make some videos in the future where I summarize this and go through it much more quickly. But this is a discussion stream. It's not one of those streams. So let me just briefly summarize. I'll give the sort of the quick version here. So in responding to this guy. So first of all, reburial is plausible. I don't argue that the Romans sort of stole the body. I argue that Joseph of Arimathea reburied Jesus because he always intended it to be temporary storage over the Sabbath, let fevers die down, move it into a mass grave later. Individual hallucinations. Individual hallucinations are plausible. They happen quite commonly, even in people who don't have mental illnesses, especially bereavement hallucinations. I don't argue that these individual hallucinations occurred in multiple people like simultaneously. That's a separate point. That's the collective experiences. And some people do fail to gain insight into their hallucinations, and I cited some examples of that. Oops, I skipped over the collective group religious experiences. Okay, so again, I don't agree that I have to account for all of the facts that are stipulated in the Gospels. I'm only trying to account for the minimal facts. So I'm not going to just accept all of the details of the Gospels and try to account for those. That's shifting the burden of, shifting the goalpost rather, because I'm trying to account for minimal facts. That's the argument I'm responding to. I don't need to account for the fact that people's mental states would be exactly the same at the same time, because that's not what I think happened. I think that mechanisms that I cited with respect to collective experiences and then later memory distortions and socialization pressures coalesce these accounts into a standard form, which was then passed on and later embellished by the gospel writers. I don't think that you have to say that they were simultaneously hallucinating exactly the same thing. In terms of Paul, I just said that resurrection hypothesis does not explain Paul's conversion, and I don't accept that James was converted by an experience. I think the experience came after his conversion, and that's also not, well, sometimes, I should say sometimes it's a minimal fact, but it's not a minimal fact that Craig put forward. Memory and cognitive biases doesn't explain the physical details. Well, you can hallucinate someone touching or eating something, but also I don't necessarily think those were even part of the original stories. I think those were elaborated on later and came out later oral tradition, probably not the original accounts. Finally, socialization, marginalisation of doubt. These factors may not explain why later people convert to Christianity, but they're not intended to. They're trying to explain why the disciples came to the belief that Jesus had resurrected and how they came to coalesce their accounts into a coherent form. And doubt was marginalised, and people just felt that they had to believe. That was the context they're in. They didn't have any other choice. Where else were they going to go? What else were they going to do? This was their livelihood now, right? We have to have prior knowledge of what God would want to do. He argues we do have prior knowledge because Jesus said he was going to be resurrected. Well, if that's the case, then it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. Disciples thought he was going to be resurrected. They saw the empty tomb and one or two people hallucinated. So bang, there's even less that you have to hypothesize how happened there, because it's just that's what they expected. So that actually helps me. It doesn't help the Christian at all. Finally, the resurrection appearances as stated in the Gospels are not what you would expect under the resurrection hypothesis, because if God wanted to vindicate Jesus, you'd expect a lot better vindication from the God of the universe than these pretty lousy accounts we have from Gospels written anonymously decades after the fact that disagree with each other about the details. All right, so that concludes the response to this. I guess this is an anonymous gospel as well, because I don't know who wrote this, but apparently it was from rationalist.com. So I won't say the name of the person who sent it to me, because I don't know if they exactly want me to say that, but thanks for sending this to me. I appreciate that. I encourage any thoughtful response to my RHBS model. So let's see, I'll stop sharing that. Now, there's a few other things that I wanted to share before finishing out today. I did promise that I would respond to a very brief response that SJ, this name again. S.A. Thomason gave to my RHBS model. But before that, I'm just thinking, is there anything else I wanted to mention here? Yeah, I wanted to say a few things about the Gospels, because I've been thinking about this more recently and after the 10-hour stream as well, because the RHBS model doesn't really refer to the Gospels very much. It just takes the minimal facts and works from there. It doesn't really draw much from the Gospel, but a lot of Christians want to pull in more from the Gospels. So I was just thinking about sort of the nature of the Gospels, and I found some a very interesting Wikipedia article, which I wanted to share with you briefly here. Hey, load. Oh, it's pretty big. Now let me share that. Here we go. So can you see that? Yeah, it's a little small. So this is overview of resurrection appearances in the Gospels and Paul. This is just a really handy reference table because it compares the key elements and shows which Gospels, or I guess which accounts that they're in, including the different endings of Mark. And the point I want to make here is you can see that there is some overlap, especially in the synoptic Gospels, which are interdependent on Mark, obviously. But there's really quite a lot of differences. And I was looking at this when in response to the response that I was looking at before, when he was talking about the different resurrection appearances and other things, and saying, well, which gospel is that in exactly? I mean, the point is that they're all over the place. I mean, I guess I don't need to read through this. I can leave you to look at this. But see, this to me does not look like what we would expect if this process is being overseen by the omnipotent God of the universe, and he wants to leave a reliable record here. Yes, there is historical information in the Gospels, I think, and I don't think it's not like it's all concocted after the event. But it just looks like people writing different accounts, but based on a core of old tradition with a lot of interpolations and extrapolations and later tradition and added on. And it just looks like a bit of a mess, to be honest. Is this really the best the God of the universe could do? Why don't we have something better? Why don't we have something that could not be accounted for through naturalistic means? I just find it really hard to believe that this is the product of the God of the universe. Well, that's a very good point, Mind Onion. I should be using Conservapedia, which famously had a picture of Hitler on the top of the article about evolution. At least they used to. I don't know if they still do. But actually, yeah, I used to read Conservapedia occasionally just to see what was on there. Like, yeah, it's really enraging. Like, it's not even like funny wrong or interesting wrong, or like, at least I understand your viewpoint better wrong. It's just infuriating nonsense. But anyway, yeah, you got me on Conservapedia. Thanks a lot, Mind Onion. I hadn't thought about that website for a long time, and now I'm thinking about it. So there's one other thing I wanted to mention here, that there are lots of Gospels. The Christians like to appeal to the canonical Gospels and Acts and so forth, but they're a tip of the iceberg. Oops, wrong thing. So I just wanted to share another Wikipedia article here. Again, it's controlled by Satan, so you can't trust it. But this is a list of Gospels. Now, obviously, you've got your canonicals here, and the hypothesized sources, so Q, M, and L. But then you've got lots of apocryphal and pseudo-epigraphal Gospels, Gnostic Gospels, Jewish Christian Gospels, infancy Gospels, Gospels that we just have preserved in fragments and that are lost, but others referred to in ancient sources, and then some written in medieval and even in modern times. So, most Christians just going to say, well, these other ones were forgeries, or they include erroneous information, so we don't have to worry about them. Not so fast, though, because, first of all, I think pretty much most of these Gospels, well, let me say one thing. Any of them that are preserved were thought to be important by someone, because otherwise you wouldn't preserve them. So all of the ones that at least were preserved, and probably any that we know about, someone believed. That itself is interesting, that people kind of believe anything just because a book says it or a Gospel says it. But second of all, many of the people who wrote these, I think, were sincere. Now, some of them may have written them for monetary gain, especially some of the later pseudepigraphal ones that were under assumed authorship. Although a bunch of those ended up in the New Testament as well, because at least some of the Gospels some of the books of Paul are almost certainly not authentic Pauline letters. But look at all these Gospels here. So particularly, I wanted to point out Thomas. Thomas is thought to have been written in the 1st century, maybe early 2nd. That's basically at the same time as like the Gospel of John was written. So we can, we can just say, well, John had it right, and Thomas, whoever wrote it, had it wrong. But the point I want to make here is not, I mean, yeah, maybe that was the case. But the point I want to make here is that all of these gospels here, many of which were written in the 2nd century, a few of them maybe late 1st. As far as I know, these people, or most of these people, were all sincere. They believed what they were saying was authentic, in the sense of that it reflected truth, even if not necessarily historical truth in the way we'd understand it. Although some of them may have thought that as well. I'm not an expert in this stuff, right? I'm not pretending to be. All I'm saying is that what the Christian has to think is that all of these people writing these later gospels were either in it for monetary gain, or crazy, or just willing to make things up and lie on behalf of their beliefs, even though some of these people certainly were persecuted. Like Gnostics received a lot of flack from proto-orthodoxy types. But anyway, you have to say that they are not to be trusted, and they're basically, not reliable, made things up. But the canonical gospels, whoever wrote them, no, they were pristine. They were reliable. They checked their facts. They didn't make things up. They didn't embellish. But what's the basis for that distinction? The only basis for saying that they're different is that the later gospels are later. Now, granted, in history, we do assume that earlier texts are more reliable. But I'm not saying that the later gospels are more reliable. I'm saying the fact that they're willing to embellish to make their point and to say things that they nevertheless think is true is indicative of the fact that I think basically all early Christians who are writing these gospels were willing to do that, unless you want to say that some dramatic change happened from the 1st to the 2nd century in early Christian history, where suddenly everyone writing these gospels, not just the Gnostics, but others as well. It's not just the Gnostic gospels here, infancy gospels, for example, and other fragmentary preserved gospels, many that are lost. All of these people were somehow became super unreliable and willing to make things up, whereas in the 1st century they weren't. And even the 1st century doesn't work for some of the gospels, like Thomas, which is probably 1st century, and I think Peter as well. There's also, as someone mentioned, I think there's some dispute about exactly how old that one is as well. What does it say here? After the composition of 4 canonicals, Sputum, and places in the first half of the 2nd century. So that's a little bit after John, but not too much. So Peter is also quite early. I mean, if you're going to say that John is dated, I think, 90 to 110. Maybe Peter was written, I don't know, 130 or 140. Like, what's the big change that happened in those 30 years that mean we could trust the Gospel of John, but not the Gospel of Peter? I mean, I guess the one way around this is that some Christians will just date everything super early. And so all of the canonical super early, but then that's implausible historically because that's just not supported. Even mainstream apologists like Habermas and Craig don't argue for really early Gospels. So the point I'm making is that I believe that there is lots of evidence that the gospel writers were willing to embellish. They were willing to reconstruct things on the basis of what they thought must have happened, based on stories that they'd heard, on reports that and traditions that they'd come across, but not necessarily based on any evidence, or just interpolate things. We know that in early histories, it was very common to just write a speech and put it in the mouth of a historical person, even if, of course, they didn't actually say those words, but to preserve the gist of what happened or to make a point. I think that all of this was happening in the compilation of the Gospels, which is how we go from an early tradition. I do believe there was early eyewitness tradition, but I think it was quite sparse. Maybe it's something like 1 Corinthians 15. It's basically just a list of appearances. It doesn't say anything about the nature of those appearances. That's what maybe was passed on. And then all of the other detail in the Gospels with respect to the appearances was interpolated, built on from later stories or traditions. It must have been this way, sort of thing. And the point is that, although I don't know that the Gospel authors did that, all of the other Gospel authors were doing it. So why do we think that the first Gospel authors, including maybe Peter and Thomas, who were not far away from John in their writing time, why do we think that the say John and the other Gospel writers were so different? So this is just something that I think Christians should acknowledge more, that there's so many Gospels out there that they don't believe and that have details that they don't accept. And you have to ask yourself, well, why do we think that they were willing to make things up or to embellish and reconstruct and so forth, but the earlier Gospels, and even sometimes not that much earlier Gospels, weren't willing to do that? It's a bit ad hoc. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that. And that's sort of in response to people who might want to put more detail, might want to move it beyond a minimal facts argument and say, well, the Gospels have all these details. And I ask, well, how do we trust those details? And I'm not convinced. All right, so let's finish out by now playing some of this. No, wrong button again. Share screen, share audio, and we're going to look at this one. Now, this honestly is probably not worth responding to just by itself. The main reason I decided to add it is because, well, I'm already doing a stream and I just found out about this video and might as well respond to it. Okay, so this is a response to obviously our 10-hour stream on the resurrection, responding to Andrew Loke's book. So this is S.J. Thomason responding to us, responding to Loke. So now I'm going to respond to someone responding to us, responding to Loki. So it's like a response to response to a response. But this is how these things go. Hopefully there'll be a response to the response to the response to the response, and we just iterates infinitely. Anyway, let me know if the sound's working. Let me turn this up a bit. All right, I'll start off with the RHBS. So people who've listened to some of my
and we have
got a
Apologia.
It's awesome. Welcome. Well, Apologia can actually articulate his theory. So yeah, my RHBS hypothesis may be familiar to some who've watched some of my videos before. So the hypothesis is named after the key elements: reburial, hallucinations, biases, and socialization. So the basic idea is that it's designed to explain all of the standard minimal facts, which includes an empty tomb. Whether or not you think it was one, I think that at least we could try to explain if there was. So my hypothesis is that the tomb was empty because Jesus' body was removed by Joseph of Arimathea because it was a temporary burial to ensure that the body was taken down over the Sabbath.
Okay, so he's positing something that
remove it.
Okay, so he's positing that Joseph of Arimathea temporarily put Jesus into the tomb. Now, there's some counter arguments to that. Number one, let's note the fact that Joseph of Arimathea, we have no indication of that in any of the references of Joseph of Arimathea, that he was going to temporarily keep Jesus in the tomb. Number two, the women who followed Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb went to the tomb on Sunday fully expecting to be able to bring spices and take care of and anoint his body. And they were surprised when they found there was no body inside of the tomb. And so 2 points refute that. The ancient historians, ancient people reporting back then refute that. But he'll persist, even though there's absolutely no reference that says Joseph was going to leave him in there for a couple of days, and then who knows what he was going to do with the body after that. So I certainly don't see that being the case when he treated Jesus in such a loving way, bringing him over to the tomb.
All right, so first point here. Why is it implausible that, I have no reason to think that S.J. Thomason has read my book or anything more than this video. And I fully acknowledge my brief account there is not like persuasive. It was just supposed to basically give an idea of where I'm coming from. That's what we were doing at the outset. We weren't trying to convince people or give reasons for thinking what we're saying was true. It's just so you can compare what we think to what Loke thought. I don't even think I necessarily articulate it in the best way there. I probably need to think about ways of being more persuasive about a brief summary of the RHBS model, because it is a bit complicated. I mean, things are complicated, right? You can't going to make them so simple. But anyway, so it's fair enough if you didn't find my brief presentation persuasive, but nevertheless, so I don't want to be unfair in saying, well, you didn't read it, so you can't respond fully, but she is still responding to it, so I'll make a response here. Now, she first said that we have no indication from the ancient sources that Joseph of Arimathea had any intention of doing any such thing. Now, I think people who've been listening probably know what I'm going to say at this point. Yes, of course, we don't have any record of that. There's no reason we would have any record of that. All we have are Gospels written decades after the fact from people who almost certainly weren't there. Yeah, sure, relying on some oral tradition, but there's no reason why they would have included any details about Joseph of Arimathea, whom they didn't know. Joseph of Arimathea, I don't think, had any interest in being an ongoing part of the Christian community, or even if he did, if he's saying he removed the body, then he's going to be ostracized because he's like, oh, no, guys, I removed the body, and they're just going to ignore him if he did say that. But I suspect he probably wasn't interested in being part of it. I don't think he was. I think he may have been a sympathizer, possibly, to the extent that he thought Jesus was getting a bit of a rough deal. But, I mean, maybe not. That's just a possibility. But I don't think he wanted to be a supporter. You can be sympathetic without being a supporter of someone, right? There's a distinction there. Pilate is portrayed as being sympathetic towards Jesus, but certainly not a supporter. So why couldn't Joseph of Arimathea have been similar? So I think most likely he didn't want to have anything to do with the ongoing Christian community. And so whatever he did or happened to have said about it wasn't preserved. And even if he did say things about it, the Christian community wouldn't have preserved those. Remember, we do not have any first century accounts that are hostile to Christianity. Zero, zip, nada, zilt, zitch. Niet, nothing. So saying that we should have that, we would expect to have that, is ridiculous. And again, it's an argument from silence. If we would expect to have this particular detail about this figure, why shouldn't we expect to hear more about the corpses walking around Jerusalem? I think that you should always use that as a counterexample to anyone arguing from silence. Because if you could not have reports of corpses walking around Jerusalem for everyone to see, you can certainly not have accounts of Joseph of Arimathea not wanting to remove the body. I don't even see why any accounts would have even been written about that. I don't think Joseph wanted to be involved. So this is a very, very weak argument from silence here. Excitement and the uproar of the... So that was one thing she said. The other thing that she said is that Joseph of Arimathea lovingly buried Jesus, and so it's inconsistent that he'd want to later remove the body. Well, what I hypothesize is that I think I even said this in the summary. Maybe I didn't. I should have explained myself more clearly. The reason I think that Joseph removed the body is the most likely thing that I think happened is that Joseph always intended to move the body. It wasn't even really buried. It was more just stored in his tomb because A, the Sabbath was coming and they needed somewhere to quickly put the body that was nearby. And B, it was important to put it somewhere that was private, out of the way, secluded, relatively unknown. I mean, maybe some people could follow to the tomb, right? But I don't mean that it was like a public location that everyone already knew about, like the mass graves would have been for the resurrection. So when I say secluded, I don't mean like secret necessarily, but just private and out of the way. So as to avoid further trouble and further uproar, which was a big concern of the Romans. And the Jewish leaders had to ask for permission for the Romans to execute Jesus. And so they wanted to stay on the good side. They didn't want to make a big issue of it. So they knew the Romans didn't want to have a fuss. That would have looked bad looked bad for the Jewish authorities. So it was in their interest as well to ensure that that didn't happen. So that's, I think, the reason why Jesus' body was placed in the tomb. Again, assuming it was. Again, I'm taking that for the sake of argument. So Joseph of Arimathea always intended to move it after the Sabbath as soon as he could, which was on the Friday evening. That's why when the women went to the tomb, it was empty because it had been moved on the Friday evening. On the Saturday evening. Now, maybe you'd say, well, Joseph would have told the women. How do you even know that they knew who Joseph was? I mean, again, assuming for this sake of the argument, Joseph was a real person, I think it's plausible he was, but maybe he wasn't. But supposing Joseph was a real person and the burial narrative happened as described, why would Joseph have told these random women followers of Jesus, whom he probably never met in his life, that he was going to move the body? Even if he wanted to, how would he have known how to find them? It says they scattered afterwards, right? So, the women didn't scatter, though. They kept on looking. But even so, like, why would he be interested in doing that? Even if he did tell them and they got word, oh, the body's been moved, they're going to want to go and check anyway, right? And they found it empty, and maybe they saw the risen Jesus as a hallucination, so they didn't believe that his body had been moved. There's so many possibilities here of what could have happened. But the problem is, I can't tell a narrative. I can't say exactly what happened because I don't know. I'm trying to be honest here and saying, here's a possibility, but there's lots as well, and I'm not sure. And that's just never as persuasive. So that's why I don't think that we're always going to have an uphill battle here in offering these, because they're just not as narratively persuasive as the gospel accounts. But I don't think these objections are very good because, yeah, as I said, there's no reason we would hear anything about what Joseph of Arimathea was planning. Very weak argument from silence, and there's no reason he would have told the women what he was planning to do. That occurred when Jesus was tried. And then on Sunday, after the Sunday and on Sabbath, the body was removed, and the women followers came on Sunday morning and found the tomb empty. Upon that happening, one or more of them experienced some sort of bereavement-based derived hallucination of Jesus, which they then told to Peter and all the other disciples. That triggered a series of appearances as a result of a combination of bereavement, the fact that the tomb had been reported empty, and the initial reports, plus general sort of excitement and trying to make sense of what happened. So that's the hallucinations part. But those experiences were not necessarily what's reported in the Gospels. In fact, I think that they probably... This is a good point, although the thing is, what Christians usually do is... for those who were just listening, Bob is saying the Gospel accounts aren't exactly narratively cohesive either. True, although individually they are narratively persuasive. And what Christians normally do is just... basically, like Loke did in his book, they just make their own harmonization and then basically believe that. Do you know that I didn't even know when I was a Christian that the birth narratives of the Nativity were that like half of it is in John and half? No, sorry, I'm going to get this wrong. Half of it is in one gospel and half of it is in the other. Is it Matthew and Luke that they're in? I think. I didn't even know that until later on, and I read up on this. Like, wait, what? How did I never realize this? This is actually really interesting. That maybe this other Christians will resonate with this. I'm not saying I was the most well read on this sort of stuff when I was a Christian, but we read that nativity story like every Christmas for years when I was a child, and I remember reading it. We read some from one gospel and some from the other. I think it's Matthew and Luke, right? So it's not like I didn't know that they were from different gospels. It's somehow they never put together in my head that like, hey, half of the account is not in the other. Like there's actually an inconsistency here, because to a Christian, it's all the Bible, right? It doesn't matter which gospel it's in. Like to your standard Christian, I'm talking about, not to the apologists. They understand that. I've even had discussions with Christians where they don't seem to understand that originally it was a bunch of separate documents that were then compiled together into what they now call the Bible. They think the Bible as one book, especially the New Testament. So to your average Christian, they don't even sort of, maybe there's a dim reconnaissance of this, but they don't really understand it. They don't appreciate the fact that these are from different documents written by different people at different times. And so the narrative cohesion is there for them. They just sort of read the parts in a row that they make sense in their sort of harmonized version. And of course, the scholars aren't bothered by that because they just harmonize it away, or they have different ways of dealing with it. But I'm talking for your average Christian. I think the fact that it's in different gospels just doesn't seem to bother them. But it should. I mean, it should bother them. It's just that's what I mean by narrative cohesion. For them, it's the whole thing. Well, we weren't like those. They were appearances of or experiences of an unknown sort. Then over the succeeding days and weeks, as the apostles
I'm having
sort of
trouble here stopping this. Okay, so sorry, my thing is just sort of lighting up here a little bit. What I wanted to comment about that is here's what we do know from the Gospels. All 4 Gospels report that the women were the first to discover the empty tomb. And I think I made that pretty clear. They traveled in groups, but they separated at times. And they initially went back and told the disciples that they saw the risen Christ, and the disciples did not believe them. Mary Magdalene was actually the first one to witness the risen Christ. And other women also witnessed the risen Christ. And so he was appearing to people. Now, that's not mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 as that early creed, because again, you'll recall from Josephus that women's testimony was not to be considered valuable. And so the reports are mainly of men, specifically of men mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. And so that's what we know from our witnesses. We don't have ancient evidence supporting an alternative story that Mary was merely crafting a vision of a person, a bereavement vision of Jesus. Because again, let's remember what happened after this and what they did. A bereavement vision doesn't drive somebody to preach that the person resurrected from the dead and was with them and ate with them and drank with them and did all the things that Peter and others mentioned that Jesus did with them.
So even on what I've said here, which I'll acknowledge is brief, it's hard to see how Thomason's really listening to what I'm saying here, because it's an RHBS model. At no point do I say the hallucinations, especially in individual hallucinations of Mary, however, are sufficient to lead to someone to preach the resurrection. I don't say that. And obviously I'm not saying that because it's an RHBS model and I'm going through the steps here, okay? It's hallucinations plus the empty tomb plus the subsequent collective appearances plus the memory biases plus the socialization effects and all of that stuff together that generates the belief in the resurrection and leads them to believe it and go on and preach it. I said that here in brief. And it's strange to object that a single hallucination to Mary wouldn't be sufficient. Oh, no, I don't think it was sufficient. I also don't object that the women were the first to the tomb. I don't understand why apologists bring this up so much, because it's just granted. Sure, they found the empty tomb. I don't see the problem with that. It doesn't prove anything, in my opinion. Well, they think it suggests the reliability of the empty tomb. I don't really know how to assess that, but since I'm granting that anyway, it doesn't matter for my purposes here. So that's not an objection. I'm not sure if she thought it was, but she mentioned it, so I'll just clarify. It's not an objection to my account because I grant that the women discovered the empty tomb. So yeah, I don't argue that a single hallucination by Mary or any of the other women, or anyone in fact, was sufficient to generate all of what happened subsequently. There's many other steps to it, and that's the next parts of the model. Also, it was strange when Thomason said that that Mary's not crafting a narrative. Well, I didn't say she crafted a narrative. I said that she experienced a bereavement hallucination, or Mary, or one of the women, right? That's not a made-up crafted narrative. That's an experience that she really had, which was meaningful to her. So I don't understand where the crafted narrative comes in. The narrative was developed later through processes that I discuss, but I don't think anyone was being devious about it. They thought they were getting to the truth by, reading the scriptures and praying together and discussing it and so forth. It just, I think, now we understand that those are the mechanisms that led to a development of an account that was not actually what really happened, that led to delusions, effectively, false beliefs that they held to very confidently. But I didn't say that Mary made it up or anything like that. That's not part of my account. And I think that even in the brief summary I gave, that should have been quite clear.
Now I can't get it to turn back on. Hold on. My thing's frozen up here. Let's go back. Okay, so let me just fix this again.
Yes, I love this point. Thanks, Gabriel. It's a shame the modern average Christian isn't one of the 500 diehard skeptics who witnessed Jesus. Yes, because Loke said this, and I think Craig and others say this, that the 500 and also the initial apostles were really skeptical. They wouldn't have been convinced by anything less than really solid evidence, and they would have checked with each other and fact-checked. And likewise, the people that Paul was preaching to in Corinth and everyone else would have checked and fact-checked and gone all that way to check with the witnesses. Whereas it seems that early skepticism really died out, and most Christians actually just accept what they're taught in Sunday school and what they read in the Bible without further thought or doing a skerrick of research. I was one of these people. And although I did think about my faith, I always did, probably more than most, but I didn't think about it in sort of a historical, critical context. It just never occurred to me to think of it that way, to be honest, until I learned more about the Book of Mormon. But that's a separate question. So I never deconverted on the basis of critical assessment of New Testament, because for me it was the Book of Mormon and then Mormonism, and then I lost my faith in Christianity as part of that. But the point is that was the norm, and I think it's the norm for most Christians. So it's a bit odd to think that everyone in the first century was super skeptical. But yes, I think that is a very profound point, actually, that should be raised more often. First century Christians were nothing like modern Christians. They were super skeptical and evidence-based. If only we had that these days.
for the nth time. Okay, let's get back here. Share the screen. All right, so my thing was freezing up there, so I'm just...
By the way, I'm not saying Thomason is like that person who never thinks or critically analyzes things. I'm just responding to a point that's been made, and with respect to my own experience and many other people, that most Christians don't engage with any of this stuff and don't require very good evidence for their beliefs. So it's a bit odd to say that the earliest Christians or earliest people would have as well.
Returning it back to the video. All right, here we go.
Together and read through the scriptures and prayed and fasted and whatever else they did. They had further experiences in groups of the risen Jesus appearing to them and interacting with them in some ways. And as they discussed this and the experiences got sort of refined in terms of what they believed happened, and there was memory contamination, memory biases. That's the biases part of the model. And then,
okay, memory contamination, memory biases. Again, this is another very similar conspiracy theory in that they develop these all uniformly. And we're talking about multiples of people developed memory biases. Okay, conspiracy 101.
and finally, as time went on. So I mean, obviously I'm biased here, right? But it's hard for me to understand how anyone can listen to what I just said, even granted they don't know anything else about what I've said, listen to what I just said there and get from that I'm advocating a conspiracy theory. If anyone in chat thinks that it is in any way reasonable to infer from what I said that I'm advocating a conspiracy theory, then I'll back down from that, because I know that I'm biased here. But I feel like that is just so ridiculous to infer from what I said that I'm talking about a conspiracy here. Memory contamination and memory biases and other effects like that are not a conspiracy. That's just a completely different phenomenon. I don't even understand how you can confuse that from what I said. This is when people talk to each other and they confuse each other's memories for their own. That's memory contamination. Memory biases is when you remember things that didn't happen. Your memories change over time through reconstructive recall. That's completely different to a conspiracy theory. You're not making it up deliberately to plot anything. That is nowhere part of my account. Even the gospel authors who I think did make things up, I think that they didn't think of themselves as lying or being engaged in a conspiracy. They thought that they were extrapolating or embellishing in good faith, and that was accepted and so forth. But I'm not even talking about that here. I'm just talking about the initial disciples and the other people who experienced the appearances. So my question to Thomason, if you ever watch this, how do you get, am I so unclear in my communication that when I say memory contamination and biases, that it's reasonable to that a reasonable person infers that I'm talking about conspiracy there? I legitimately don't understand how one can get that out of what I said. Maybe I need to communicate more clearly. I'm open to that, but that seems to be so far off what I said. And people began to tell these stories. There was a process of socialization where if anyone sort of was dubious of something or wasn't quite sure, they were reinforced by the community they were in, or shunned outside of it, if because they would have been lacking in faith, or they would have been illustrated to have a sort of spiritual deficit if they didn't believe or didn't remember correctly. And so as a result of that, you can get within a few months, I think, sort of a creedal-like story emerging of a series of, and at least possibly that's what was passed on, and Paul eventually heard, and we see the product of that in 1 Corinthians, and then later that is the basis of the stories, along with then further legendary developments and extrapolations and later traditions that were incorporated into the Gospels. So
one of the things about the Gospels that you guys might want to make mention of, and you might want to note, and the reason why the Gospels and the other books of the New Testament were accepted into the canon is because the people who wrote those books were considered either eyewitnesses or friends to eyewitnesses, people who knew the eyewitnesses. For example, we believe that Matthew and John are apostles, among Jesus's apostles. We also believe that Luke was a doctor, but he was also recognized as an historian. Luke was traveling with Paul, and so Luke was a witness with Paul, but Luke also, and that's mentioned starting in Acts 16. We know that the book of Mark was written by somebody who was a good friend of Peter. And so that's made mention of throughout Paul's writings. He talks a lot about Mark, and Mark at one point leaving and then coming back. But Mark was written by a person who was an associate of Peter. And so we have that kind of evidence. And we got a lot of internal evidence that these sources are the ones that we say they are. We have no ancient sources pointing to any other authors aside from the four mentioned. But one of the things that we see in these Gospels are some pretty embarrassing things. Like, for example, when Jesus' family...
Hang on. So she's sort of moving a little bit here. So I want to respond to what she said first before talking about embarrassing details. So I don't know why we would have any ancient ascriptions to different authorship, because the traditional authorship was accepted as traditional, right? It's sort of unclear to me why we would see any other authorship. So Thomason is saying, we believe, and then she mentions traditional authorship of all four Gospels. I don't know who we is supposed to be. That's certainly not critical scholarship. That's not even people like Lacona. Even Loke didn't argue this, or Habermas, or Craig, or any of the others who argue for the minimal facts style approaches. They're not arguing for traditional authorship. I mean, they may elsewhere, but they're certainly not doing a minimal facts approach. And I don't know if they all do agree with minimal. Why do I keep saying minimal? With traditional authorship. So I don't know who we is. I mean, that's rather unclear to me. I don't even think a Christian has to believe in minimal authorship. It's just minimal authorship from now on. For some reason that word keeps getting in there. Doesn't have to believe in traditional authorship. So that's a bit unclear. But I mean, I guess you're saying that she believes that, which is fine. I don't believe that. I think I'm on board with the majority of scholars there who don't believe in traditional, I got it right, traditional authorship of the Gospels. I think that the RHBS model does get harder if you think that, say, Matthew and John were written by actual eyewitnesses, because it becomes harder to understand how there was so much extrapolation. But I think we just need a few extra hypotheses to account for that, probably. More memory distortion perhaps needs to happen, and maybe we have to analyze how they would understand history and what was acceptable for them to say as a little bit even more liberal or accepting than perhaps we might otherwise have thought. Because it's one thing if you're a later author who's drawing on oral tradition, and another thing from if you were actually there personally for writing this, right? You'd think that would be a bit more constrained. I mean, I don't think that was the case. I'm just thinking, suppose that we did grant traditional authorship. I think that you could still use the RHBS. It would need to be adapted a little bit to account for that. We need to make some more postulates. But I think that that's not really a problem, because traditional authorship is so implausible anyway. And there's so many other things that you wouldn't expect to see in the Gospels if they were written by traditional authors, like the differences. Like why is Matthew and John, why are they so different if they're written by people who are at literally the same event, standing next to each other, and they write things so differently? That it's one thing if they're different authors compiling later tradition, but if they were literally both standing there, why are they so different? So I think that, yes, the RHBS model doesn't fit traditional authorship as well, but I think it could be adapted to fit that. But the traditional but there are lots of other things that don't work very well with traditional authorship. It's implausible, and it doesn't fit with what we actually see in the text. So I don't grant traditional authorship, but even if I did, I don't really think it would be that much of an issue here. Also, not really sure how it's an objection to anything that I've said, unless you think that traditional authorship does undermine what I've said. But then I guess I'd like that to be made clear, because I don't think it necessarily does. Yeah, maybe there's a few extra hypotheses we need to bring in. It doesn't fit quite as well with the later development of what it says in the Gospels, but I still think it works as an explanation. So I'd like to hear a bit more about why traditional authorship totally undermines what I'm saying here. Anyway, let's hear what she has to say about the embarrassing stuff.
They tried to stop his ministry. They thought he'd gone nuts. When Jesus said, hey, you consider me a drunk, he said something like that, or I drink, or something like that. And so he pointed out stuff that people would consider embarrassing. Jesus says to Peter, on this rock I will build my church. And that particular rock decides to deny Jesus 3 times. That's embarrassing. And so we've got a lot of embarrassing stuff. But then if you go to the first book of Acts, you're going to see that Jesus' family had come around. What made him come around? He was just brutally executed and crucified on a cross. And there they were with the other apostles in the first book of Acts, talking with them and believing in Jesus. James, his half-brother, went on to preach in the temple at Jerusalem for years until he was martyred. And Josephus reported his martyrdom. Okay, so we also know that occurred. We also know from the book of Acts, 2 people, James, the brother of son of Zebedee and brother of John, and we know that Stephen were also martyred. So it was no easy deal to be a Christian at that point. And so let's just recall this. These people aren't getting together crafting some story so that they can propagate something that's going to bring them death. That doesn't make any sense.
Sorry, I thought you'd finished there. Why does it feel like it's gotten small? There we go. Okay, so it's a bit hard to follow the thread of what she's saying here. So there are embarrassing things in the Gospels. I don't really trust the criterion of embarrassment, because it's very subjective about what is embarrassing. I think there's a theological purpose served by the denying 3 times. I mean, you've got the number 3 there, right, to start with, but also I'm not qualified to really speculate on that. I think it seems clear though that there is a theological purpose there, that the gospel writer, whichever gospel that is, I don't know, included there. So I think we can account for that using other means. But I mean, what does that have to do with what I'm arguing here? I'm not claiming. I think that Thomason thinks I'm talking about what I think happens is a conspiracy theory that the disciples got together and made it all up. But that's not what I'm claiming. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that that's not what I'm claiming. So the fact that there may be some embarrassing details, would have to ask the gospel authors or interrogate the gospels as to why their authors might have included those. And I just don't see what bearing that has on what I'm saying. I'm not trying to account for those particular details anyway. I mean, maybe those things happen. Maybe Peter did deny Jesus, for all I know. I don't really see how that even refutes the hypothesis, because he could deny once and then he experiences something, then he comes to believe, right? So I don't think he did, but it's just, again, I don't see how that would be something that would refute the model. Something about on this rock I'll build my church. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, that fits with the first will be last and last will be first, right? So I don't even see that that's how an embarrassment. That's consistent with a theological motif that goes throughout the text there. But again, I'm not an expert on that stuff. I don't pretend to be, so that's not my area to try to explain these particular motifs or aspects of it. But I just don't see how that refutes what I'm saying here. What else? Yeah, his family later converted. I've talked about that already. Yeah, they converted. I mean, assuming that they were skeptics, they were unbelievers originally, which is not a minimal fact, so I don't grant that, but maybe they were, as far as I know, they could have been, and they converted later. I mean, yeah, that doesn't contradict anything that I've said, so I don't see the issue here. They weren't making up the narrative. I don't say that they were, so that's not. I'm talking about socialization effects. Socialization effects is not the same as a conspiracy. Marginalization of doubt, like for example, if you doubt, well, then you think that you're sinful, or you got to introspect, and then you talk to others and you say, oh yeah, actually I do remember seeing Jesus in, or something like that. That's sort of how this works. Memory contagion plus socialization. That's what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about a giant conspiracy.
That's the basis of my explanation. Obviously, we can get into more details when we go through and look at what Loke has to say. So who's going next?
Yeah, either do you want to talk briefly, Paul, and just introduce your kind of engagement on this and your theory of what's going on with the resurrection accounts and the data we see in brief?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for...
Okay, I don't think she has anything else to say about my account. So I think the big problem is that she seems to think that I was advocating a conspiracy theory, plus empty tomb, I guess. So reburial plus conspiracy theory, which is not at all what I'm arguing. And I honestly don't see how anyone could get that out of what I said. I acknowledge I may not have been as clear as I could have been, but I just don't think I was that unclear. So I'd be interested to hear more substantive thoughts about what I actually did say and maybe what I've articulated here, if Thomason or others are interested in commenting. While I'm here, I might just have a listen to what she says about Pelagia. She talks about Camille a lot more. I'm going to leave that just because it's longer than I want to go through, but I feel like there's some relevant things she says about Pelagia's comments as well. Skip forward a little bit.
We would prefer that all of our stuff be written. So mainly I'm here tonight, as to that stuff. But here's 3 new ones that I can, that at this point, and we're now entering a phase where he and I are going into
Realize that group
hallucinations, group appearances.
Paul is smart in here. He does realize that group hallucinations are not possible because, like dreams, they aren't shared. You can't share a dream. Like, I can't call you up and say, I'm going to dream that I'm over in Spain right now. Why don't you come on with me? It's not possible. So group hallucinations in the same way aren't shared. It's just not something that's medically possible, as the way that people have defined what hallucinations are. But another thing I want to mention about Paul is a Canadian. I've had him on my channel before. I've actually debated him on the minimal facts of the resurrection, that sort of thing. And Paul is willing to grant that some of the apostles were indeed martyred. He actually got onto another debate with Sean McDowell. And Sean McDowell's written a pretty good book.
I didn't know that Paul had debated Thomason before. I must have missed that when I first watched this video. That's interesting. Maybe I should check that out at some point. With regard to the group hallucinations, that's one of the reasons I don't talk about that, because I agree that the way hallucination is typically defined, it's an individual, not a collective or objective phenomenon. And she wasn't directly responding to me here, so I won't say that she misinterpreted me there. But because I have to clarify this point all the time, it's not a group hallucination. It's a group religious experience, which consists of many elements, among which includes individual hallucinations, but they're not all hallucinating the same thing. The analogy to the dream, I think what I've said before fits this well. You can't share the same dream with a person, but if you say, hey, I dreamed this, and then you go to sleep the next night and you both have similar dreams, you wake up the next morning, you talk about it, and you could come to believe, if you have a sort of sufficient worldview to allow this, that you sort of shared a dream, even though you didn't actually share a dream. You just both dreamed the similar thing separately and then talked about it. I think that's pretty much what happened, analogous at least to what happened with the disciples.
That I haven't read yet, but it sounded like it was good in his fate, where he really looked at some of the evidence surrounding the martyrdoms of the apostles, and he figured out which ones seemed highly probable and the most probable, and which ones were less probable because they were less attested. But what tradition has us believe is that all except for the apostle John were martyred, and they were martyred in pretty gory ways. Sometimes they were skinned, they were put in buckets of burning oil, they were crucified, they were beheaded. Paul was beheaded by Nero. That's reported by a number of early church fathers, and so we have that. So here we go.
Of the risen Jesus, that very narrow.
Why is that relevant? There's a particular new strand. Maybe it's because of who did all that? She just mentioned, I've forgotten the name, but the guy who did all that work about the martyrdoms. To me, that it's interesting to know what happened or what records we have, but it's just not. It's only relevant if you think that they weren't sincere in their beliefs, and I think that the disciples were sincere, and I think most people do, even a lot of skeptical atheists. So it feels like it's rebutting something that's not really that controversial. It doesn't establish what they believe was true. It just establishes they really believed it. There's lots of martyrs for lots of different religious causes around the world. I don't think it establishes much of anything.
Specific topic is what we're discussing now. In general, I do have a personal hypothesis. I was kind of tired in dealing with these resurrection discussions of Christians pushing back at me and saying, hey, no one's putting forth a single unified theory. You just keep putting forth 8 or 9 theories. Why is that? You must have a weak position if you have so many things. So I decided to put forth one that I felt was closest to what I believe probably happened. The one that James put forth is equally plausible in my mind. But I don't think that I don't think there's sufficient evidence or good evidence for a empty tomb. So in my study of history, it seems at very least that quite often Roman crucifixion victims were either left hanging on the cross, tossed in a ditch, or put in a mass grave. Those seem.
Okay, one of the things that's going to refute him is actually something I'm just going to bring up really quickly, but one of the things that you have to think about this, he's making a generalization to the Jews for what Romans did, and the Romans allowed the Jews to act out exactly what they wanted to do as far as their beliefs, and the Jews very specifically believed that he couldn't be kept up on the thing, especially over a time when the Passover was going on, and there were a whole bunch of people in the area, and so that's something that we know. We know that from Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23, they were supposed to be buried in a tomb. That's Jewish customs and law to keep the ground pure. We know from Tacitus and Josephus that Jews even buried malefactors, okay? We know that Christians were martyred. We know that also even from people like Suetonius and Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. We know that he was executed and crucified from people like from Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Celsus, Talmud. We know that he died on the eve of the Passover, according to the Talmud. So we know a lot of stuff. And we know that some of the things that were going on were consistent with ancient Jewish practices. Now, whether or not the Romans believed the Romans did that to their own people or people who were non-Jews, that's another question. But you have to go back and look at what Jewish laws were during this time. That's the most important thing. And so hang on one second while I get to.
Sorry, I couldn't really follow what she was saying there. She's saying that other people are martyred or killed by the Romans, including crucified, and we know stuff about them. Are we supposed to know that they were also buried in like an individual tomb? Was that among the facts that we're supposed to know? Maybe I should listen harder. I was just criticizing her for not listening carefully. I just couldn't quite follow what we're supposed to know that contradicts what Pelagia said. Yeah, because it seems to me that I acknowledge this, right? I accept the burial by Joseph of Arimathea as a minimal fact for the sake of argument. I'm sort of agnostic as to whether it really happened or not. I think that there's some reasons to think it maybe did, but there's other reasons to think it didn't. So I think it's sort of borderline, but I'm happy to sort of grant it for the purpose of argument and then have a discussion there. But the point is, most of these victims would have just been buried in a mass grave. That was the standard practice. Thomason didn't really refute that. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess I just missed the relevance of what she was saying there.
One more thing I wanted to mention. We also know from someone like Clement of Rome, here's an extra biblical source, who was born in the year 35 and died in 99. He said, "Let us fear the Lord Jesus Christ, whose blood was given for us. Let us reverence our rulers. Let us honor our elders. Let us instruct our young men in the lesson of the fear of God. Let us guide our women towards that which is God." Okay, so he said a number of things. Also mentioned Jesus' resurrection. So let me find, I've got a slide here that I'm trying to see. Okay, we're getting to, the Jewish burial practice. So here's some things. So according to Bart Ehrman, criminals considered enemies of the state were not allowed decent burials. However, Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, Egypt, stated that Romans had a practice of allowing burials under, quote, various circumstances. Furthermore, such an allowance is consistent with Jewish beliefs. Like I mentioned before, Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, which was predominantly Jewish. So here's what Deuteronomy says. If someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. So it is likely an insurrection would occur if a Jewish person were left on the cross, since they believed firmly their land would be cursed. They wanted to ensure purity of the land. Now, here's something else coming out of Houston Baptist from Craig Evans. He says, the most pertinent statement comes from Josephus, who complains of the crimes of the rebels during the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 73. He finds particularly heinous, now Josephus is a Jewish historian, the rebels' treatment of the ruling priests whom they murdered. He said, they actually went so far in their impiety as to cast out the corpses without burial, though the Jews are so careful about funeral rites that even malefactors who have been sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset. So that's just a quote from Craig. So here we go.
Seem to be things.
There appears to be a lack of precision here about what is exactly being claimed. Pelagia is claiming that the standard Roman practice was to bury crucifixion victims in mass graves. Nothing that Thomason has said has refuted that. One thing she said about responding to Bart Ehrman's quote is that there were some cases in which exceptions were made, like giving the body to the family or something like that. I've heard of some examples of that as well. And that's what I actually think plausibly happened if indeed Joseph of Arimathea was the one who buried it, as I talk about, because of the unique circumstances surrounding Jesus. But you see, you can only have an exception if there's a rule to which it's an exception. And that's precisely Pelagius' point, is that the rule was that they're buried in a mass grave. There were some exceptions, so maybe Jesus was buried in a private tomb, but more likely, Pelagius' argument is that it was buried in a mass grave, because that's what usually happened. Now, as to the points about the fact that Jews are really careful to take a body down before the Sabbath and bury them, I mean, I cite that in my book. Yes, that was part of the Mosaic law. Part of the Mosaic law. But that doesn't distinguish between the two hypotheses. One hypothesis, he was buried in a private tomb. Second, he was buried in a mass grave. They're both a burial, right? It's the difference between leaving them up on the cross or just sort of throwing the body on the streets. I mean, that would have been unhygienic anyway. I don't think the Romans would have liked that. I suspect that's probably what was being referred to in that other rebel case, because if you really want to disrespect someone's body, you don't bury it. You just leave it out and have people, throw things at it or whatever. See it decompose. That's what the Romans did with the, what was it? I think it was the Spartacus uprising. They crucified all of these slaves on a road from somewhere other to Rome, and they just left them up there for months or something, because it's a warning, right? It's disrespectful and it's a warning to other people. But the Jews wouldn't have liked that, and because it went against their law, and possibly would have caused further problems because of the ruckus that was involved in Jesus. So I don't think the Romans would have liked that in that particular case of Jesus, that is. So yeah, they buried him. Now, did they bury him in a mass grave, as Pelagius says, or did they bury him in a private tomb, at least temporarily, as I tend to think? Nothing Thomason said has distinguished between those possibilities. So I don't really see I just don't see the point of what she was saying.
That happened most of the time. I have Mike Licona and Gary Habermas both agreeing with me on camera that is the thing that most likely happened. So as soon as you have something that is the most likely thing to happen, I don't see a reason to prefer this kind of odd exception. That I don't disagree that exception could happen, that someone in the Sanhedrin could take the body and put it in a personal tomb. Sure, because it seems like there might even be precedent for that in history in other cases. But why go to something that isn't the most likely thing? And if we don't have an empty tomb,
see, he can't make a claim that it's the most likely thing, going back to what I just told you about, and also just going back to what we have as far as the ancient evidence. We have ancient support for Jesus being buried in the tomb. Paul has zero ancient support for his assertions.
There's a whole cascade of things that I know.
Well, hang on. So that's kind of shifting the goalpost here, because what Pelagius is doing is offering an account to explain not the same minimal facts that I do. I'm not exactly sure what fact his account is intended to explain. I think just the origin of the belief in the resurrection, because he doesn't grant the empty tomb, for example. But that's what you should hold that account to doing. How well does it explain the facts it's trying to explain? He's not trying to. So he's, for example, trying to explain why there was, or how the accounts developed, right? And so obviously, if people believed that Jesus had been resurrected, a natural question is what happened to the body. If they didn't know what happened to the body because it was buried in a mass grave and people didn't know where it was, then it's fairly natural to see how they could develop a story about, well, there was a tomb which was then found empty because, of course, Jesus was resurrected. So you start with the belief originating from other sources and then work back towards a belief around stories that developed in an empty tomb. Now, Pelagius, I don't know if he goes into details about how he thinks that belief developed, but obviously it's a later legendary development. I've already talked about how other gospels are full of these legendary developments. And so, I mean, we have lots of precedent for this, right? Someone in the chat mentioned that the Gospel of Peter, which was written probably around the same time or maybe slightly after John, includes like, what was it? The cross comes alive and walks around and talking or something like that, which is super weird. But is it really weirder than what's reported in Matthew about the graves opening and people walking around Jerusalem? So I don't actually, yeah. So the point is that there were lots of strange ideas floating around in these early Christian communities about what happened. And I don't think that it's unreasonable for Pelagius to offer his account about how he thinks that those originated, and his account doesn't require that there actually was an empty tomb. So the fact that we don't have people saying that there wasn't an empty tomb is irrelevant. We don't have, again, this is a very weak argument from silence. We don't have any hostile or critical accounts from the first century about Christianity. We have zero. So of course we're not going to hear any accounts like that say there was no empty tomb. We wouldn't expect to see them. That's not a good objection to what Pelagius is saying, because he's making a hypothesis and seeing what we should assess is how good is that hypothesis in accounting for the relevant data.
No longer have to explain. Obviously, the explanation with the fewest multipliers of assumptions is best. So given that, I also feel like the only person who we have really sufficient evidence that they had an appearance of Jesus prior to Paul having one is Peter. And I actually picked Peter somewhat arbitrarily, because it seems that someone had to have started this idea that Jesus rose from the dead. It can't have been Paul, because his conversion was after this story was circulating.
But let's report again, as we noted at the outset, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul also says that Jesus appeared to him. In fact, Paul makes it really clear when he's writing the epistles and he's writing his books that the words didn't come from him. The words came from Jesus. He makes it clear that Jesus is communicating through him as he writes. And so that's just something to note.
Are we really supposed to be persuaded by that rebuttal? Well, Paul says that the words came from Jesus, so they must have come from Jesus. Like, of course, Paul thought the words came from Jesus. That was part of his experience. That's what he believed, right? So that doesn't prove that that really happened that way. It just proves that Paul believed that it happened that way.
And it seems like Peter and Paul met each other. If you look at Galatians chapter 2 and chapter 4, they seem to have met each other. So it seems to make sense to me that Peter might have been the one to start this. You may have seen a video on my channel this week regarding post-bereavement hallucinations.
What Paul's explanation also doesn't explain is Paul. Okay, Paul was a Pharisee. What reason would Paul have to go meet with Peter and suddenly convert to Christianity so that he can be brutally attacked by Jewish people? In fact, 40 Pharisees took a vow that they were going to fast. They weren't going to eat until they captured and murdered Paul. We have that reported. Paul was constantly on the run. He was being whipped, jailed, persecuted. He had a lot of high esteem, and he had a lot of stance in the Jewish synagogues prior to converting to Christianity. He thought Christianity was a flawed mistake. And so he thought he was doing what was right in the eyes of God by going after Christians. Paul, with his explanation, doesn't explain Paul's conversion to Christianity. He just says, oh yeah, he met Peter and Peter convinced him of this story. I mean, how gullible do you think Paul is? Paul was known to be studying under Gamaliel. He was considered extremely intelligent, and he was very well read and well spoken, and he knew the scriptures quite well. So he hasn't explained that at all.
I brought on.
Well, I don't know if Pelagia explains why Paul experienced. This is why I need to call him Pelagia, not Paul, because otherwise I've got two Pauls here. It's confusing. I don't know if Pelagia specifically says why Paul experienced that hallucination. He may do. I'm not super familiar with all that he said about this, but the thing is, I don't even think he has to. He can just postulate that, well, Paul had some sort of hallucinatory experience, right? Because the reason that's not a problem is because the resurrection hypothesis doesn't explain Paul's conversion either. It's an extra postulate. Oh, by the way, after being raised up to heaven and after the initial appearances to his followers were finished, Jesus just randomly, a couple of years later, appears to this guy who he never knew in life and converts him. That's ad hoc as well. So I think it's less ad hoc to say that Paul experienced a hallucination and converted on the basis of that, because that does sometimes happen. Whereas this other, what the Christians say, is totally unprecedented. Both are somewhat ad hoc, but I think that the naturalist saying that Paul hallucinated or something, that's more plausible. So I think that this is another example of what I was saying before. The Christians just don't seem to realize that the resurrection hypothesis does not account for Paul's conversion. It just doesn't, because Paul doesn't fit in the same category as the disciples. Different person, different time, different place. There's no reason to think that Jesus would have any reason to appear to Paul unless you just hypothesize that he did. But then why not hypothesize he just had a hallucination?
On Shannon Q, who is studied in psychology, and she looked at some of the typical objections to post-bereavement hallucinations, usually surrounding how old someone has to be, when really the data doesn't.
That's a good point, Bob.
The data is adjusted for the number of deaths that occur in that certain period of time. It seems like you can have a post-bereavement hallucination at any given time, and actually the age period of 30 to 39 is particularly susceptible.
So Paul is trying to posit that Peter had a post-bereavement hallucination, and that somehow Peter was able to convince all of these other disciples, and even Paul, who wasn't worshiping Christianity at all. He was going after and persecuting Christians. He was able to somehow dupe them into believing this whole thing. This is also conspiracy 101. Maybe this is the upgrade, conspiracy on steroids.
Susceptible. Pardon me. It's late.
So Poleg is not arguing for conspiracy here. I don't know quite what his mechanism is for Peter experiencing a risen Jesus to the other disciples believing him. I'm assuming that, because I don't think Pelagia hypothesizes that there was further, that necessarily that the 12 had further experiences. So that's one of the things that I postulate, because I think it allows you to explain maybe a bit easier why they came to believe. But I mean, I'm not really, I think it's also what Pelagia says is possible as well, that the other disciples believed solely on the basis of reading the Old Testament, plus the disappointment and trying to make sense of it, plus Peter saying that he saw the risen Jesus. The others came to them believe as well, and did not themselves have experiences. Now, I think it's a bit more plausible that they just also had experiences, which then helped them to get the same fervor. But I mean, again, this is where it's just indeterminate because we don't really know. We don't have enough evidence. I think either is possible. I have slight preference for my account, well, maybe more than slight, moderate preference for my account. But I think that what Pelagius says is also plausible too. So the point is, though, it's not a conspiracy. They're not making this up. It's not motivated with evil intent, which is the implications that Thomason seems to be making about what we are, or here Paul argued, but earlier also what I said. That is not what either of us have said here. So I think it is disingenuous. I mean, again, it's hard to see how that she gets that out of what Pelagius is saying, because he's not saying that. He's saying that Pelagius is saying that Peter really did have an experience of Jesus. It was just a hallucinatory experience. Peter told the others, they believed him. Why wouldn't they believe him? If Jesus really did say that Peter was the rock on which he built his church, and Peter says, hey, I saw Jesus, you should believe Peter, right? So what's so implausible about that under her own views?
Anyway, so if Peter had a post-bereavement hallucination and started spreading the word, if some people started to buy into this, we know that memories can be implanted based on repetition, based on wishes. There's a lot of reasons why.
You're humbly questioning. So there's lots of things that you can postulate. You can postulate a seizure. You can postulate schizophrenia. You can postulate mania. You can postulate post-traumatic stress disorder. You can postulate that he just fainted because he was, dehydrated, and then he had some sort of experience in the sun, and Jesus was on his mind, so he interpreted that as Jesus. All of these are plausible, but they're ad hoc. That is, we don't have any reason to think them except for the fact that Paul reports some experience. So the point I'm making is, I think we do need to realize that they're ad hoc, but it's not a problem that they're ad hoc because the Christians don't have anything better. If there is some reason that they could give that naturally follows, okay, so for example, suppose we had good reason, it'd be hard to know how to substantiate this, but suppose we had good reason to think that Jesus actually did, while he was alive, say, hey, there's this guy, Paul, and he's really important to me, something like that. Obviously, if we did see that in the Gospels, we'd assume it was a later interpolation, but suppose we somehow did get evidence that it really was, Jesus really did say that, then that would give us reason to think he did have intentions, like the Paul was special and picked out in some way. And then it becomes less ad hoc, right? But we don't actually have that. Paul only comes on the scene later. So it's just as ad hoc for the Christian to say that Jesus wanted to appear to Paul as it is for the atheist to say that Paul had some sort of psychiatric problem or something else happened. It's just that, so they're ad hoc, but I think that the atheist or skeptic is more plausible because we know that those things happen, whereas we don't know that Jesus appears to people randomly. Like, this seems to be the only example where he does that. So I think that's less plausible. If we have reports of him persecuting that have a high probability of inducing, yeah, that's fair. I think it's difficult to assess these things historically after the fact. But yeah, you may be right. Maybe we could construct an account that's less ad hoc there. Possibly. I don't know enough about PTSD to discuss that. But yeah, maybe there's something to be said about that. But in general, I think it's fine to say that the atheist account's ad hoc, but the Christian is more, I think. So they're no better off, and I think worse off.
Memories can...
You guys have to think about exactly what happened with Jesus. Now, he was crucified brutally, hung up on a cross. That was the most egregious form of death that the Persians had invented and the Romans had perfected. Now, it's one of the kinds of forms of death that only the criminals and the worst of the worst were put up on these crosses, and they were hung to display as a Roman source of power, Romans showing off their power and flexing their muscles. Slaves were executed in this way. It was completely embarrassing. You're stripped down to barely any clothing, if any clothing. You're whipped, you're beaten, you're mistreated, and then you're forced to carry your own cross. So what Paul is crafting here is that suddenly Peter is going to be able to get all these people to believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead when only he has some sort of post-bereavement hallucination. This just doesn't really answer any of the questions surrounding what we know about the crucifixion and what even comes from ancient extra-biblical sources.
Solidifying.
I don't see any substance to that rebuttal. Mostly she just talked about how horrible crucifixion was. I don't think anyone's denying that. Why does the horrificness of crucifixion mean that the disciples couldn't have come to believe that Jesus was resurrected when Peter told them that he had experienced Jesus appearing to him? I don't see how that follows. Now, Loke would say something like, well, but the disciples were really skeptical and they would need really solid evidence, not just Peter telling them. That's just an ad hoc postulate. We have no particular reason to believe that. But Thomason doesn't even say that here. She's just sort of asserting that the disciples wouldn't have believed Peter if he had said, Jesus appeared to me. I would add that there is more context than that, because remember, the fact that their Messiah has been taken away from them and killed when they didn't expect it is world shattering to them, and they're trying to make sense of that. So they're going to grasp at anything that allows them to make sense of it. And they're poring over the Old Testament at the same time as well. And then Peter says, oh, Jesus appeared to me. So in that context of them being, fearful, upset, trying to make sense of it, confused, reading the scriptures, Peter tells them this. I think it's quite plausible that they would come to that belief. Now, I think the plausibility is increased if they had their own experiences, which is then why I explain that more in my account. So I do think it is better than Pelagia's account. Nothing on Pelagia. But I still think his account is plausible. I just think mine's more plausible. But the point is, I don't think that Thomason's really said anything to convince us that what Pelagia said can't happen. She just sort of says crucifixion was terrible, therefore the disciples wouldn't have believed Peter. But why? How do you know that they wouldn't believe Peter? It seems quite plausible to me that they would. People believe all sorts of things for very little reason. You look at the history of new religious traditions. Why did people believe Joseph Smith when he said, God and Jesus appeared to me, and here's this Book of Mormon? People believed him. People believed Muhammad when he said, God spoke to me. Or well, I guess Gabriel spoke to him through God. God through Gabriel. And many other cases throughout history. So we're just going to say no, that couldn't have happened for the disciples, even though that there are psychological reasons to motivate them to believe this because they wanted to make sense of it. They wanted to find meaning, cognitive dissonance, all that stuff. I'm not convinced that there's that we have good reason for thinking that the disciples wouldn't have believed Peter and that wouldn't have been sufficient. I think that that's quite plausible. And certainly Thompson's not saying anything here to convince me otherwise.
In the community, and even seemed very genuine and real, that story just starts to spread from one individual. I also
another good point
agree
here.
That I agree that Paul wrote 7 of the letters that are attributed to him. And so in Corinthians, he says himself that he had a vision. I'm sure we'll get to it. I think that I take vision just to mean a non-physical body appearance. And if it is a physical body, there's a lot of weird things. And I'm sure we'll get to that when it gets to those chapters of his book. Anyway, so if you get down to Peter and Paul, each having some sort of hallucination, that we can really explain all of the data as to why the church exists. And that's all one needs. Dr. Loke really hates that theory. He calls me fringe. He thinks that because no one else adheres to that no scholar that he can point to, that therefore it's not worth discussing. And yet we're having this weird written debate. So I don't know where to stand.
Okay, so I see a question coming from Digital Gnosis. Now that I've listened to the 3 arguments, So the Camille argument essentially says that all of these people colluded together to write a fantasy. They got together and they decided that they were going to make up this whole story because they pieced together what they understood from the Old Testament. And they decided to say that Jesus resurrected, even though it did not benefit them at all. Okay, and then we have the other 2 representations, again, not taking into account what the apostles did over those years, what the motivations would have been, and what the attestations are. So we have attestations that others aside from Peter had seen the story. You guys have to think about this in a modern context. A lot of people seem to think that the ancients were just a bunch of wingnuts and dummies and they're gullible and all this kind of stuff, but that was hardly the case. You can see the evidence even throughout the Gospels and that of people who were highly skeptical of this kind of stuff. You even had doubting Thomas. He was highly skeptical of this kind of stuff. And so suddenly all of these people, tradition has it, people like Thomas actually went into India and ended up being martyred. And so you've got a lot of other people who are highly skeptical. They're not just going to fall for Peter's story. What is he selling them? He's selling them the idea that, guess what? You're going to be praying and worshiping Jesus and you might end up getting killed for it. But I saw the risen Christ and you got to take my word for it. Okay, that's what Paul is trying to articulate here. I'd say probably the fact that Camille spelled out so much from the Old Testament and he also spelled out a lot from the New Testament. And he seems like the fact that he's granting miracles and he's granting Yahweh's existence, and he even said, the father of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all that kind of stuff. I think Camille probably made the most powerful case here, the most well thought out case. But I also think if Camille takes this to its logical outcome and realizes that this would be a conspiracy of the highest extreme, I think that that's just something to consider. Okay, so I'm going to come over here to the chat here and see if you guys have any questions or thoughts before I.
So it's disappointing. She thinks Pelagia is advocating conspiracy theory. She thinks I'm advocating a conspiracy theory. She thinks Camille's advocating a conspiracy theory, even though none of us are advocating a conspiracy theory. I just don't understand how she gets that out of what any of us said. Camille, I think, spoke a bit longer than any of us, than either myself or Pelagia. So I think that I probably wasn't very persuasive because I didn't really give much in the way of details. I was just very quickly outlining it, which is fair. I wasn't really trying to be. Again, we're just sort of outlining where we're coming from. Also, Camille granted the most, so I guess that's part of why he was more persuasive, because he's like just granting that Yahweh exists, which it's an interesting tactic. I think that there's definitely place there, but yeah, I just have worries about the way that's going to be received. Anyway, but also, yeah, this point that the ancients were skeptical. She says, Thomason says that we need to place this in one context. No, don't do that. Okay, sometimes you can make analogies to things in the modern world, and there's ways to think that can help, but don't place it in modern context. That's called a historical anachronism. You don't take something out of its historical context and put it in a completely different context 2,000 years later in a very different social and intellectual context, and then make inferences on the basis of that. That is a terrible way of doing history. yeah, no, don't do that. You need to understand what they would have thought plausible, how they would have thought, how they would have reasoned in a first century Jewish, well, I guess sort of Judeo-Greek / Roman context. And people there were not skeptical. I mean, people today still aren't very skeptical, right? People believe all sorts of nutty things, but they were even less skeptical then. They did not have a concept of science. They did not have a concept of critical thinking in the way that we would understand it. They did not have a real concept between the distinction between natural and supernatural, I think. Not to say that they didn't have a concept of miracles, but the way we would think about that, I think, was very different to how we would think about that. They didn't have the same concept of even history that we have, the idea that you only say things that you can sort of substantiate by citing your sources and so forth. There were some historians that sort of did that, but even they would often sort of embellish or add quotes and things that we would now regard as a historical malpractice, but they thought that was fine. The fact that the initial gospels are all anonymous is another thing that we would not regard as acceptable today. So the point is, there's so many things that are different about the historical context, the social context, the intellectual context, that you can't just put this in today's context. And the thing is, even in today's context, there are new religious movements. Like we talked in this discussion here about the Rebbe. I always forget his proper name; it's too long. Something Mearson or Schmearson, whatever. But the Rebbe, who people believed was the Messiah and then died and is still alive, and he died like 25 years ago. That's a modern Western context, and people are still coming to that belief, right? But it's just, I think, ridiculous to claim that people in the ancient world were as skeptical as they are today. They didn't have any of the same tools that we do. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have scientific thinking. They were not post-Enlightenment. Lucian writes scathingly about how superstitious most people were and all of the ridiculous things that they believed. And Camille talks about that as well. We mentioned this in the discussion. I think it is absurd to appeal to the skepticism of people at the time, especially the disciples, people whom we have accounts of just leaving their nets and following Jesus, whom they barely knew, at least as far as we can tell from that passage. Those do not seem like skeptical people. The only evidence we have for that are the avowals of prior skepticism that we see, which is very clearly and is well known to be an artistic or a rhetorical device used in writing to make the accounts seem more plausible and to basically make it more persuasive to the reader. I don't think that there's any reason to take that seriously or think that they actually were that skeptical. And just people in new religious movements in general are not, many of them are not very skeptical. Irrational belief persistence is widespread. Even today, I mean, how many people believe that, the coronavirus was a hoax, or that the Earth is not round, or that Earth is like 10,000 or 6,000 years old, or vaccinations are a hoax, or any number of things which there's overwhelming evidence against? People still believe, despite our post-Enlightenment, scientific, literate. Yeah, by the way, there's another difference. Where a literate culture, they were predominantly not a literate culture, literate, information-saturated society. This is just not how you should think about the past. And yeah, a very bad response, I think, as well. A very bad rebuttal to say that, they were just super skeptical. We've no reason to think that.
Move on here. I wanted to see which do I think is the best one. In any context, your ideals wouldn't work. Love your channel. Well, thank you, Machines of Love and Cast. Every once in a while, someone says something nice. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the likes. It's so funny. I don't think I've made a video that hasn't had at least 2 or 3 dislikes. And so today it looks like we're coming in at 2, but maybe somebody in the chat is now going to hit the thing and make it 3.
Oh, come on. You always get dislikes. Well, I mean, maybe she doesn't, right? But if she never gets dislikes, that's a bit much to hope for, right? There's always some people who dislike your video.
I don't know. But I wanted to say, so I'm going to try to do some reviews of the bad apologetics from Nathan's channel.
Yes.
So if any of you have a particular favorite, because it looks like this is apologetic number 13. If any of you have a particular favorite that you'd like me to review, and you'd like me to get give feedback on or anything like that, let me know. Hit me up. And somebody mentioned something like,
exactly.
Why did I not invite anybody in? You might have seen, I didn't pre-plan this. I actually was downstairs I was a little bored in my house trying to figure out what to work on next. And then I was flipping around on YouTube and I happened to spot this video. And I thought to myself, so I read part of the transcript and then decided to make a video. So this was not planned. So I didn't invite anybody on for that reason. But if anyone is interested in coming on my channel, the best way to reach me is by email. Or just leave a comment in the comment section, because I do read the comments. But if you leave me an email, you can email me to alwayslearning1225@gmail.com, and I'll be sure to see that. What do we see here with Camille? It says, would be great to see your reviews. Look at the playlist. Okay, so there's a playlist, I guess. So I will take a look at his playlist, and I'm going to have to make a playlist myself. So Stephen Steen is saying something kind of relevant here. He says, atheist apologetics throw out a bunch of random ideas and whine about them being logical and have to be true with no evidence. One of the things that I found that was faulty
That's what we do, folks.
In a lot of the assertions here is that people would assert something like there was no empty tomb, but then they have no ancient evidence to support it. It's kind of like the idea that people assert that the apostles, the named apostles, were not the authors to which the books and the gospels were attributed. However, there's no ancient support pointing to anybody else. Okay, we've got all the early church fathers right away pointing to these particular 4 men as being the authors of the gospels. And
do you know that a lot of skeptics and atheists will say that Jesus wasn't actually, the Son of God, but we actually have no ancient sources to support that. I mean, yeah, there are sources later on, Gnostic traditions, and then other skeptics will say, but I mean, first century sources, there are no sources from the first century that say that Jesus was only a man and was not the Messiah or not the Son of God. We have no sources for that. So the skeptics just can't justify their belief that Jesus wasn't the Son of God or even the Messiah, because there's no sources from the first century saying that.
we also know just from Paul's story.
Hope the problem with that argument is clear with that sort of snarky counterexample, but it's a terrible argument.
So Paul isn't actually completely referencing what the Apostle Paul did say about the appearance. He said Jesus appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, then to 500, then to James the brother, then to Paul. He didn't say, and he appeared as a vision to me. He never said anything about a vision like that. Okay, he appeared to Paul later on, and so Paul had given them a lot of credit. He gave the other apostles a lot of credit, but he actually ended up working harder than any of them in bringing the good news to people. And so I think that probably the first person that Paul should acknowledge, apologia, is Paul. Okay, so anyway, I want to say thank you guys so much. Please like and subscribe, and do come again. Got a telephone call on Zoom I've got to do in a couple minutes, so I will see you later. Guys, have a great day.
Okay, yeah, so I don't know a lot of the detail about what the early church fathers said. I was just assuming she was talking about like early, first century, very early authorship, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I do know there was debate about that, debate about which books to include in the New Testament as well. But I mean, that's sort of why I said, well, we don't have any first century ancient authorship saying that Jesus wasn't the Messiah or Christ or God incarnate either. So I guess we should just accept that, right? Any other theory about who or what Jesus was is coming from later documents or later sources. So we should reject that. That's such I don't like to say stupid because it's a bit rude, but it's just, look, if you're just willing to accept whatever the Gospels say, then you just turn to the part where it says, Jesus was the Christ, it was God incarnate, first parts of John, whatever, in the beginning was the Word, and then you believe that, and then we don't need to bother about all this because this is all superfluous, right? And then we could just be honest and say, look, it's not a minimal facts argument, it's not an historical argument, it's not an anything argument, it's just this is what we believe because this is what the Gospels say. At least that's honest, right? Straightforward. I respect that to an extent. I do respect honesty at least. But so the skeptics are not required, like me, we're not required to restrict ourselves to what people in the ancient world, well, actually to what we have records of what people in the ancient world say. We didn't even know what they said, but even if they didn't say it, well, so what? I mean, just because most people didn't care about Christianity, so they weren't talking about it, it doesn't mean that it's true just because that's what the people who believed it thought that it was. Do I have to say this? Like, look at any new religious movement, and the earliest things that have been written about them is mostly, maybe it's a bit different in the very modern world because we're so literate, but mostly it's going to be people from that tradition, right? And they thought what they thought. Right, the very earliest things about Muslim are from Muslims. The very earliest things about Buddhism are from Buddhists. Right, this is just how new religious movements go. So just because they say it, it doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that's what they thought was true. At least the very earliest ones of them thought that was true. Same for a traditional authorship of the Gospels. It's what people, the very earliest people apparently thought. Doesn't mean that it was true. There's lots of other reasons which biblical scholars could say far better than I can as to why we shouldn't ascribe them to traditional authorship. I mean, I guess the Gospel of John's the easiest one. If John really wrote John and we take the traditional dating, then he would have been like one of the oldest people ever in the first century. He would have been probably about 100 or in his late 90s when he wrote that, which is very unlikely. Now, then you have to say, well, I actually wrote it earlier, but then that has its own set of implausibilities. So anyway, I can't believe that that's being used as a serious objection here, that we don't have ancient sources, as if the ancients were infallible and the only things that we can believe are the things that they said, and we can't believe anything that they didn't say about Christianity because the record's so complete and everything that's plausible would have been written and stated, including by critics and disbelievers, even though we don't have literally zero sources from those in the first century. So that response is really frustrating and just a bit baffling, to be honest. Because again, if that's the criteria we're going for, then we just have to be Christians because all of the earlier sources say that Christianity was true. So we just have to go with that. Yeah, so I'd be willing to discuss with Thomason more about this as long as she's willing to actually listen to what we're saying. And I'm a bit skeptical about that because she thought that Camille and Pologia and myself all were arguing for conspiracy theories, even though none of us were. And I thought we were quite clear about that. in what we said. Maybe one of us was unclear, but I don't think all of us were that unclear, such that a conspiracy theory came out as being a reasonable interpretation of what we were saying. So I'm not that interested in talking to people who just won't even be willing to listen. But if we can have a reasonable and a thoughtful and a genuine discussion, then I'm open to that. And that extends to really anyone who's interested in talking about this thoughtfully and actually listening to what I'm saying, and then we can discuss the views, and then we can offer competing explanations, and then we can hopefully learn something from each other. So that's an open invitation. This stream has already gone on for longer than I'd intended. I guess I decided to talk more about this video than I'd thought. I'm looking forward to more bad apologetics reviews, because we haven't really had any so far. I guess they are long, but I guess that provides more content than to criticize. So it's sort of win-win for that point of view. The only thing I'm disappointed is that she's calling this bad atheist apologetics, because we're not offering an apologetic for atheism. We're offering counter apologetics. We're offering reasons to reject the reasons that apologists offer. So I don't mind if you call it bad, but I just think it's not accurate to call it atheist apologetics. It's bad counter apologetics, not bad atheist apologetics. So anyway, I hope that we can straighten out the name. So looking forward to more of those commentaries. That'd be quite interesting, and maybe we can chat about this. Yeah, okay. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully you found this interesting. In terms of future streams, I've been promising that I will do one on responding to Cameron's Capture Christianity's video about logic from God. I do want to respond to that, so it's in the works. That will come out at some point when I have time. And otherwise, yeah, there's still in the works. Well, at the very early stages of works, videos that I want to do in summarizing some of these arguments and presenting them in a more concise form. For the shorter viewer. Yeah, so thanks for listening, everyone, and I'll see you around.